Luciano DeMarco burned down the Valenti Empire on a stormy night, but his enemy fled, leaving his innocent daughter behind. Sofia Valenti knew nothing of her father's crimes. She was just an art student living in the world of books and paints. But for Luciano, blood is blood. He kidnapped her before dawn and began to use her as a weapon to drag Vittorio Valenti out of the shadows. What happens next will change both of them forever. Please like and comment the city you're viewing. I want to know how far this story has progressed. The rain came down hard the night Luciano DeMarco gave the order, the kind of rain that turned Chicago's streets into black mirrors and made the city look like something from a nightmare you couldn't shake even after waking. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse on the 42nd floor, tie loosened, a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, watching the lights below blur and bleed through the downpour. Behind him, his lieutenant Enzo Ricci stood near the door with his hands clasped in front of him, waiting. Enzo had learned years ago never to speak first when Luciano was watching the city like that. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was pressure, the kind that built before something broke. "The Valenti compound," Luciano said without turning around. "How many still inside?" "Household staff, a few lower soldiers who don't know enough to run yet." Enzo paused. "Vittorio left 12 hours ago, private airfield outside Milwaukee. We think he's already out of the country." "You think?" "Our man at the airfield confirmed a departure. No manifest. Small jet, filed a flight plan to Cancun, then went dark." Luciano took a slow breath. The knuckles of his right hand whitened around the glass. His brother Matteo had been found 4 days ago in an alley off South Wabash, throat open from ear to ear, lying in 6 inches of standing water between 2 dumpsters. The DeMarco shipment routes had been handed to the FBI the same week. 3 warehouses seized, 2 of Luciano's captains arrested, $11 million in product simply gone. Every thread led back to Vittorio Valenti. 22 years of uneasy truce, 2 decades of careful distance maintained between their organizations like a wire stretched between buildings. And Vittorio had cut it in the middle of the night and blamed the wind. "Burn it," Luciano said. Enzo didn't hesitate. "Done." "And the girl?" A beat of silence. Enzo shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "She's at her apartment. University housing, Wicker Park. Graduate student, 24 years old, no prior involvement with... I know what she is." Luciano finally turned from the window. His face in the lamplight was angular and expressionless, dark eyes holding something cold and absolute that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with decision. "Bring her to the cathedral compound. Quietly. No marks, no rough handling. I want her frightened, not damaged. There's a difference." Enzo nodded once. "Tonight?" "Before dawn." He turned back to the window. The city kept burning below him in the rain. Sofia Valenti was still awake at 2:15 in the morning, which was the only reason she heard them on the stairs. She'd been working at her desk, a narrow wooden table pushed against the wall of her studio apartment, surrounded by open books and half-finished notes about a 14th century Flemish triptych she was writing her thesis on. The lamp was the only light in the room. Outside her single window, rain hammered the fire escape in irregular bursts. She heard the footsteps first. Heavy, too deliberate. Multiple sets moving in practiced coordination up the stairwell, not like neighbors coming home late, not like the shuffling ascent of exhausted people at the end of their day. These steps had a rhythm that made something in the base of her spine go cold before her brain had finished the thought. Sofia stood. She made it 3 steps toward the door before it came off the hinges. They were inside in under 4 seconds. 2 men in dark clothing, faces half covered, moving without shouting, without theater, with the terrible efficiency of people who had done this before. Sofia opened her mouth, and one of them had a hand over it before the sound came out, and then her arms were being pulled behind her back and something plastic bit into her wrists, and the world went dark beneath a heavy canvas hood. She kicked, she twisted. Her elbow connected with something solid, and the grip tightened, and someone said quietly, close to her ear, "Stop. Nobody's going to hurt you right now. Stop fighting." The words were almost worse than silence. The right now landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She was carried down the back stairwell. She counted steps, counted turns, heard a heavy door open into the wet roar of the rain outside, and then she was folded into the back seat of a vehicle, someone's hand pressing her head down, a door closing, and then the smooth acceleration of a car pulling away from the curb. Sophia sat in the dark of the hood and breathed. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking, but she forced herself to focus, the smell of the interior, leather, and something faintly chemical, the sound of the engine, the turns. They drove for a long time. She tried to track direction but lost it after the third or fourth turn, her sense of space collapsing. She thought about her father. Vittorio Valenti had kept two worlds from colliding her entire life. He'd sent her to private schools in Florence, then undergrad in Boston, then graduate school here in Chicago, always with instructions given quietly and without explanation. Never take the same route twice. Never give your address to strangers. Never speak about the family name in public. She had asked him once, when she was 17, what exactly it was that he did. He had looked at her with something that might have been grief and said, "Nothing that will ever touch you, Sophia. I promise you that." The car stopped. A door opened. The rain was louder, closer. She was guided out and across what sounded like gravel, then through a doorway where the acoustics changed entirely. Something large and hollow and echoing, like standing inside an emptied cathedral, which, as it turned out, was exactly where she was. When the hood came off, Sophia blinked against the flickering of 100 candles arranged in iron stands throughout the space. The architecture was unmistakably ecclesiastical, vaulted stone arches overhead, pillars running the length of the nave, high windows that had been bricked over except for narrow slits. But all the pews had been removed and replaced with tables, equipment, men standing at intervals along the walls with their arms at their sides and weapons visible. And at the far end of the space, where an altar would have been, a man sat in a low chair with his legs crossed and one hand resting loosely on the arm, watching her the way you watch something you've already decided about. Luciano DeMarco was exactly what the whispers had always made him sound like, which was somehow worse than exaggeration. The suit was black. The shirt beneath it was black. Silver rings on 3 fingers of his left hand caught the candlelight. The tattoos she'd heard about were partially visible above his collar, dark ink against dark skin, climbing his neck in patterns she couldn't quite make out from this distance. His face was angular, jaw tight, dark eyes carrying the kind of stillness that had nothing peaceful in it. He didn't stand. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Sophia made herself stand straight. "Your father stole from me," Luciano said. His voice was quiet and flat, which was worse than if he'd been shouting. "He killed my brother. He cost me people and money and years of work." He paused. "Now he's going to learn what it feels like to lose something he loves." "I don't know where he is," Sophia said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I haven't spoken to my father in 3 months." "That's fine," Luciano said. "You don't need to know anything. You just need to be here." He nodded at the men near her. "Take her to the East Wing, the room we prepared." And that was all. He looked away from her, back toward a table covered in papers, and dismissed her from his attention as easily as turning a page. The room they put her in had been a sacristy, a small stone chamber off the main nave where vestments would have been stored, now stripped to bare walls and a cot and a toilet behind a curtain and a single bolted door. A high, narrow window with thick glass let in gray light during the day and nothing at night. The first 24 hours, they left her almost entirely alone. Food was brought once: bread, water, a container of soup already gone cold. The light overhead stayed on constantly. There was no way to tell when day changed to night, except by the color of the thin strip of sky visible through the high window. Sophia sat on the cot and thought carefully. She wasn't naive. She understood what she was: leverage. Vittorio Valenti, whatever sins he carried, loved his daughter with a completeness that had occasionally seemed to surprise even him. Whoever held Sophia held something Vittorio would trade for. That was the logic. That was why she was alive and presumably would stay that way for as long as she remained useful. The question was, what happened when she stopped being useful? She pushed that thought aside and reached for the single book she'd had in her jacket pocket when they took her, a slim paperback edition of a French art history text she'd been carrying back to her apartment that night. She opened it and began to read. Not because she was calm, because she needed to be doing something with her hands and her mind, or the fear would swallow her whole. The guards who brought food looked at the book and said nothing, but she noticed one of them, a younger man, maybe her age, with a scar along his jawline, glanced at the cover with something that was almost curiosity before he set the tray down and left. The second day, the interrogations began. A man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, 50s, with the patient manner of someone accustomed to waiting, came in and sat across from her and asked questions for 3 hours. Where was Vittorio? Who were his contacts outside the country? Where did he keep secondary accounts, safe houses, communications equipment? What had he told her in the months before his disappearance? Sophia told him the truth, which was that she didn't know. She had not been part of her father's business. She had not known the extent of what he was. She had phone calls with him on Sundays, how his garden was doing, whether she was eating properly, what her thesis supervisor had said. That was the relationship. That was all of it. The man didn't believe her immediately. He came back twice more over the following 2 days, asking variations of the same questions. Sophia's answers didn't change because they couldn't. There was nothing else to say. On the third night, gunshots sounded somewhere outside the building, close enough that she could hear individual reports, then a burst of automatic fire, then silence. She pressed herself against the wall below the window and counted her own heartbeats until quiet returned. Nobody came to explain. The door stayed locked. In the morning, the lights went out for 6 hours, leaving her in complete darkness. She wasn't sure if it was deliberate or mechanical failure. She suspected deliberate. She sat in the dark and translated passages from memory. Latin inscriptions she'd studied for her thesis, French captions from the Flemish paintings she knew well enough to reconstruct. Her lips moved slightly as she worked. It was something to do. A way to stay inside her own mind. On the fourth day, Luciano came himself. She heard the door before she saw him. The specific cadence of the bolt, the silence that preceded him into rooms, the way the guards outside straightened. Sophia was sitting on the cot with the French paperback closed in her lap, and she made herself keep her hands still when he entered. He looked at her for a moment from the doorway. Then he looked at the book. "What is it?" he said. "Art history." She held it up slightly. "Flemish manuscript illumination, 14th century." He said nothing. He walked in slowly, looked around the room as if checking it against some mental inventory, and stopped in the middle of the space. Up close, he was taller than she'd gauged from across the nave. The silver rings caught the overhead light. The stillness was the same. That particular quality of composure that wasn't relaxation, but control, every muscle held in deliberate arrangement. "You've been cooperative with Renato's questions," he said. "I've been honest. That's not the same thing." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "You understand why you're here." "I understand your logic," Sophia said. "You want my father to surface. You believe he'll trade himself for me." She paused. "He might. I don't know him as well as I thought I did." "That doesn't bother you, learning that?" The question surprised her. It sounded almost like genuine curiosity. "It terrifies me," she said, "and it makes me angry, and it makes me grieve something I thought I had and apparently didn't." She looked at him directly. "Does that satisfy you?" Luciano studied her, his jaw tightened slightly. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Mafia royalty, entitlement, screaming. Would that be easier for you?" The silence stretched. He looked at the book again, then back at her face, and something in his expression did something complicated. Shifted under the surface, and then closed again before she could read it. "The meals will be regular from now on," he said. 3 times a day." He turned toward the door. "Mr. DeMarco." Her voice stopped him. He turned his head slightly. "Whatever you think my father did to you, whatever he actually did, I am not him. I know that doesn't matter to you right now, but I need you to hear it anyway." He stood in the doorway with his back half turned for a long moment. "It doesn't matter," he said, but he said it like a man trying to convince himself. The next 6 days settled into a terrible rhythm. Meals came reliably, as promised, though without pattern in terms of what they contained. The lights stayed on through the nights, and Sophia learned to sleep with her forearm across her eyes. The interrogations tapered off. Renato came once more, asked the same questions, received the same answers, left. She got the impression someone had concluded she was genuinely ignorant of her father's operations, which she was. What replaced the interrogations was worse in a different way. Silence and isolation and small indignities deployed with such precision that she began to understand they were deliberate, not neglect. The window sealed so no external sound came through. Her book taken for 3 days and then returned without explanation. Meals delivered by guards who were specifically instructed not to make eye contact or respond to anything she said. The shot of an unseen firearm in the courtyard outside, every night, at irregular intervals, sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 3 in the morning, so that she never fully slept. She translated manuscripts in her head. She cataloged every painting she'd studied for her thesis in complete detail. Dimensions, medium, provenance, condition issues, debates in the literature about attribution. She paced the dimensions of the room and calculated its volume. She did push-ups and lunges in the small clear space beside the cot, until her legs gave out. She did not break, but she felt it approaching, the way you feel a structural shift in something under pressure. Not failure yet, but the early signs of something that would eventually give. It was on the 8th day that Luciano came back. He came without announcement and without the preparatory silence of officials. Just the door, and then him, standing inside the room looking at her with the same unreadable composure. Sophia was sitting cross-legged on the cot with the paperback open, and she looked up at him and waited. "Your father made contact," he said. She felt her chest constrict. "Is he alive?" "Yes." Luciano looked at the far wall briefly. "He's not willing to surrender himself. He's offering money and information. He says he has documentation about—" He stopped. "It's complicated." "What is he saying about me?" Luciano's jaw worked once. "He said to tell you he's sorry." Sophia looked down at the book. The words blurred slightly. She blinked until they didn't. "He's not coming," she said. Not a question. Luciano didn't answer, which was its own answer. She nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" "Now I decide," he said, and his voice had something unfamiliar in it. Not softness, but friction, like something that didn't want to come out but was coming out anyway. He looked at her, really looked at her, not the assessment of an adversary measuring a tool, but something that lasted too long and held too much. "You're not," he started, stopped. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing." He left. The door locked behind him. Sophia sat in the silence and thought about her father's 3 words passed through a man who despised him. "He's sorry." She turned them over and found them terribly light. They weighed almost nothing. After everything, they weighed almost nothing at all. She pressed her palms against her eyes until the pressure pushed back against the thing building behind them. She did not cry. She refused. The attack came 11 days into her captivity, at 2 in the morning, which she knew because the small digital clock on the shelf, the one luxury they'd allowed her, read 2:07 when the first explosion shook the walls. Sophia came off the cot instantly, feet on the stone floor, and then the world dissolved into noise. Sustained gunfire from multiple directions, shouting in Italian and something else. A second explosion closer than the first that rattled dust from the vaulted ceiling and made the light flicker. The bolt on her door did not open. She backed against the far wall and pulled the cot on its side in front of her, which was useless but was something. The gunfire moved. She could track it by sound, spreading through the building, coming closer, retreating, a sustained firefight that had none of the organized rhythm of a military operation and all the chaos of 2 groups of people trying to kill each other in an enclosed space. Then, a different sound. Something heavy, close. A single shot that had a different quality, set higher, sharper, from outside through the narrow window. And then a massive impact in the main nave, stone and glass, and the sound of a body hitting the floor. Then nothing. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then Sophia heard something that made every instinct she possessed pull in opposite directions. A voice. Luciano's voice. Close, low and ragged with pain, saying in Italian, Enzo, Enzo, cover the east, and then stopping, and then quieter in English. Damn. She heard him slide down the wall outside her door. She heard his breathing, labored, wet at the edges. She heard the sound of him pressing something against something. Sophia looked at the locked door. She looked at the overturned cot. She was his prisoner. He had taken her from her home. He had orchestrated 11 days of deliberate psychological torment designed to break her mind. He had used her as a weapon against her father without a single moment of hesitation, and he was bleeding to death 12 inches from the door. She screamed his name, not because she forgave him, not because she wasn't still terrified, but because letting someone die when you could stop it wasn't who she was, not even when the person dying was the man who had stolen her life for 11 days. She screamed his name again and heard him say, fading, Sophia! And then she heard a second set of footsteps, running, coming fast, and voices she didn't recognize outside in the nave, and she understood with cold clarity that whoever had attacked the compound was moving room to room, and that locked door was the only thing between her and whatever came next. She grabbed the iron base of the standing lamp in the corner and swung it against the door with everything she had. Luciano! Luciano, get up! There are more of them coming! A long silence. Then the bolt scraped. The door opened. Luciano DeMarco stood in the doorway with one hand pressed against a wound in his left shoulder and blood saturating his shirt from collar to waist. His face was ash gray and sheened with sweat, the composure entirely gone now, nothing left but the raw and wrecked face of a man operating on pain and refusal. He looked at her, at the lamp iron in her hands, at her face, with an expression that held something almost like disoriented surprise. Move, he said. His voice had nothing left in it but function. Sophia moved. She put herself under his uninjured arm and took his weight, and they went together down the stone corridor while gunfire cracked somewhere behind them, moving toward the nave, through a passage she hadn't known existed behind a false section of paneling, into the chapel's old vesting room, and she pressed him down behind the long stone table, and he went down without resisting, which told her how badly he was hurt. She tore the inner lining of her jacket with both hands and pressed it hard against his shoulder, and he made a sound through his teeth that he was clearly trying not to make, and she leaned her weight into it and said, Don't stop talking to me. What's your blood type? A positive, he said. His voice was very far away. Stay with me. Sophia, I said stay with me. His head dropped back against the stone. His eyes were still open, watching the ceiling, and in the candlelight that bled under the door from the nave, everything burning and tipping and chaotic out there. She could see the angles of his face stripped of all the weight he carried, the performance of danger and authority and control entirely gone. Just a man. Just a badly wounded man bleeding in a dark room. Sophia pressed harder on the wound and watched his face and refused to look away. And after a long moment, his hand came up and closed over hers. Not to stop her, not to grip, just contact. Just the weight of a hand. She held pressure until she heard Enzo's voice, and then others, coming fast from the north passage. Luciano's eyes found her in the dark. In the flickering light, something crossed his face that had nothing to do with pain. Something sharp and distant and stunned, as if he was looking at her from very far away, or from very long ago. He said almost inaudibly, Your necklace. Sophia looked down. The silver cross she'd worn since she was 19 was outside her collar, swinging free from the struggle. When she looked back up, Luciano's face had gone somewhere she couldn't follow, eyes unfocused, tracking something that wasn't in this room, this year, this moment. New York, he said. Barely a sound. It was winter. You said... He stopped. His eyes found her face again with the desperate precision of a man trying to hold on to something that was slipping. You said stay alive. You said please stay alive. Sophia's hands went still on the wound. The world went very quiet inside her chest. She had said those words. 9 years ago. A man bleeding behind a subway station in the snow while everyone walked past. She'd been 22 years old and terrified, and she'd stayed because she couldn't make herself leave, pressing her scarf against his side and calling 911 and saying those exact words into the dark while sirens came closer. She'd never learned his name. She had never seen his face clearly. She had only ever remembered the silver rings. Her eyes dropped to his left hand. 3 silver rings, catching the light. "Oh God," she said. Enzo broke through the door with 4 men behind him, weapons up, sweeping the room, and found Luciano DeMarco lying half-conscious behind the altar table with his enemy's daughter pressing both hands against his wound and looking at him like she'd just seen the whole architecture of the last 11 days collapse into something that had no word for what it was, something that was going to require entirely new ones. The compound went quiet in the hours before dawn. The attackers, a rival cartel that had been tracking DeMarco's movements for months, had been pushed back at heavy cost. 3 of Luciano's men were dead, 7 wounded. The east wing was partially on fire and had to be evacuated. Sofia sat in the main medical room while a man who introduced himself only as Dr. Ferrante worked on Luciano's shoulder. The bullet had passed through cleanly. He would live. He had lost blood, but not catastrophically, and his constitution apparently was precisely what you would expect from a man who had survived this life for 36 years. She sat in a chair near the wall and held her own hands in her lap and thought about the snow in New York. She thought about walking home from the library at midnight and seeing the man in the alley and hearing the sound he made. Not quite a groan, more involuntary than that, the sound of a body refusing what was happening to it. She had almost kept walking. She had made herself stop. She had stayed for 20 minutes in the cold, holding a stranger together, talking to keep him conscious, until the ambulance arrived. When the paramedics took over, she had stepped back and then simply walked home, hands bloodied, heart hammering, and she had never told anyone because what was there to say? A stranger. Alive. Done. She had thought about him occasionally in the years after, not often. Just sometimes, when the day was quiet enough, a small wondering. Whether he made it, whether it changed anything for him, whether strangers could be owed things by people who would never know to pay them. She had her answer now. Enzo appeared in the doorway at around 4 in the morning. He looked at her with an expression that contained multiple things: wariness, something close to guilt, and a very careful assessment. "He wants to see you," he said. Sofia stood, followed him down the corridor. Luciano was propped upright on the medical table, shirtless, shoulder bandaged, the tattoos visible fully now. Maps of violence written on skin. He was still gray-faced and clearly in considerable pain, but his eyes when she walked in were sharp and present, and focused on her with an intensity that had changed in quality from everything before. Not predatory, not cold, something raw, something that didn't have a name yet. Sofia stopped 6 feet away and met his eyes. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Luciano said, "You knew." "I didn't," she said. "Not until you said it. Not until I saw the rings." He looked at the rings on his left hand as if seeing them from outside himself. "I was 23, he said quietly. "I'd been knifed in a fight behind the 4th Street station. Everyone walked past." He paused. "You stayed." "Yes." "You could have left. You didn't know who I was." "I didn't care who you were." She held his gaze. "You were bleeding. That was enough." The silence between them was dense with the weight of what was unsaid. 11 days of deliberate torment, 11 days of calculated cruelty aimed at a woman who had once refused to leave him dying in the snow. Luciano looked at his hands. "Sofia," he said, and it was the first time he'd said her name that wasn't a command or an assessment. "Don't," she said. He looked up. "Don't apologize yet," she said. "Not tonight. Not while you're still—" She stopped. Started again. "You said something tonight. You said my father's crimes were on me because blood is blood." She let the words sit. "But that's not how it works. You know that. Some part of you knows that." Luciano said nothing. "I'm still here," Sofia said. "I stayed both times. That probably means something, and I don't entirely understand what it means yet, and neither do you." She took a slow breath. But I need to know one thing. What? Is there anything real in what my father told your men about why he did what he did? The question landed heavily. Luciano's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked like the very early stage of a reckoning. I don't know yet, he said finally. There's documentation. Renato is going through it. Then we wait, Sophia said. And when you know what's real, we talk. She turned toward the door. Where are you going? Luciano said. Not a command this time. Almost nothing. Sophia stopped. She didn't turn around. To my room, she said. And before you say anything, I know the door locks from the outside, and I know I'm still a prisoner, and I know nothing has resolved itself. She paused. But tonight I saved your life. That's the second time. So maybe start thinking about what that means. She left him there in the medical room, silver rings and open wounds, and the specific silence of a man whose entire understanding of a situation has just shifted under his feet like ground over water. Outside in the compound, the first gray edge of dawn was pressing against the sealed windows. And somewhere in Vittorio Valenti's transmitted documents, buried in encrypted files that Renato was only beginning to crack, lay a truth that would not just complicate the war between the DeMarco and Valenti names. It would rewrite everything Luciano thought he was fighting for, and it would change what happened to Sofia Valenti in ways that neither of them could yet imagine. The documents took Renato 48 hours to crack, and in that time the compound operated on the specific tension of a place where everyone knew something had shifted, but nobody had been told what. Luciano spent the first day confined to the medical room under Dr. Ferrante's direct orders, which he violated twice. Once to walk the perimeter of the compound at 6 a.m. with his arm in a sling and 3 guards trailing him at a careful distance, and once to sit in on a debrief of the surviving men who had repelled the attack. He moved slowly. His face registered nothing. But Enzo, who had known him for 14 years, watched the way Luciano's eyes tracked toward the east corridor when he thought no one was paying attention, and said nothing, and filed it away. Sophia slept for 11 hours and woke to find a tray outside her door with coffee and bread and a small container of yogurt, and beside it her confiscated jacket, laundered and folded. She stood in the doorway looking at the jacket for a long moment. Then she picked it up, carried it inside, and sat on the edge of the cot drinking the coffee while the compound slowly filled with the sounds of a morning after violence. Men moving with the deliberate quiet of people managing pain, someone hammering somewhere in the damaged east wing, the occasional low exchange of voices. She thought about what she'd said to Luciano in the medical room. She thought about whether she believed it. She was still thinking about it when the door opened at 9 and Enzo Ricci stood in the frame with his hands at his sides and that particular expression of a man delivering news he hasn't fully digested himself. "Renato needs you," he said. "Me specifically?" "You and Luciano both." The room they used for intelligence work was deep in the compound's lower level. Stone walls, a long table covered in laptops and paper, fluorescent lighting that had no interest in being kind to anyone's face. Luciano was already there when Sophia arrived, standing at the far end of the table with a coffee cup in his hand, and his eyes on the document spread before him. He'd changed into a fresh shirt. The sling was still on. His face had recovered some color, but none of its usual composure. Something had been displaced there, something that would take longer than a day to reconstruct. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke. Enzo closed the door. Renato Gallo was 53 years old, built like a man who'd done hard physical work for the first half of his life and hard intellectual work for the second, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and ink stains on 3 fingers of his right hand. He was the closest thing the DeMarco organization had to an analyst. He had been working for 36 hours with minimal sleep, and it showed in the sandpaper quality of his voice. "Sit down," he said to both of them. Luciano said, "Tell me." "Sit down first. This is going to take a minute." Luciano sat. Sophia took the chair across from him. They did not look at each other. Renato spread 6 documents in a line across the table. Vittorio Valenti has been maintaining an encrypted archive for approximately 4 years. What he transmitted to us is a portion of it, Either everything he has or everything he was willing to give up. We don't know which. He touched the first document. This is a partnership ledger. Names, figures, dates, going back 8 years. On one side, the Valenti and DeMarco organizations. On the other side, he paused. Senator Harold Crane, a federal prosecutor named Douglas Whitmore, 2 sitting aldermen, and a trafficking network operating under the cover of a logistics company called Meridian Freight. The room was very quiet. Luciano's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Explain. The senior members of both your organizations, the people who were in place before you took full control, before Vittorio's influence started declining, they built this arrangement years ago. The families provided cover infrastructure and muscle. The politicians provided protection and redirected law enforcement attention. Meridian Freight moved product. Renato removed his glasses. Human product. Women and girls, primarily, routed through Chicago on their way to East Coast distribution. Sophia went still. In her peripheral vision, she saw Luciano's hand close around the coffee cup. Your brother Matteo found the ledger, Renato continued, looking at Luciano. Not from Vittorio. From inside your own organization. He found it because he was auditing a logistics discrepancy in the South Side warehouse accounts. He brought it to Vittorio because he didn't know who inside your organization he could trust. Renato set down a second document. Vittorio tried to reach you directly. 3 attempts, all intercepted. We found evidence that someone in your inner circle was monitoring and filtering your communications for at least 18 months. The silence was different now. It had weight and temperature. Matteo was killed, Luciano said. His voice had gone very flat. And the evidence was staged to make it look like Vittorio ordered it. Yes. By who? Renato looked at him steadily. We're not certain yet, but the communication intercepts point to someone with access to your private correspondence, your schedule, and your personal security protocols. He paused. Someone very close. Luciano set the coffee cup down on the table with careful precision. He looked at the documents. He looked at them with the expression of a man standing in a room he's known his whole life and realizing the walls are a different shape than he thought. Sophia watched him. My brother was trying to stop a trafficking operation, Luciano said, and they killed him for it. And then they pointed me at Vittorio and let me destroy his organization and abduct his daughter. His voice stopped. He looked at Sophia directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained something she hadn't seen in his face before. Something that wasn't guilt yet, but was in the same family. Something that sat very close to it. He looked back at Renato. Who else has seen this? You, me, Enzo. That's it. Keep it that way until I tell you otherwise. Luciano stood. I want names. Every man in this organization with access to my private correspondence in the last 2 years. Cross-reference against Meridian Freight's personnel records. Vittorio's archive includes those? Partial employee rosters. Yes. Do it. He walked out of the room. Sophia stayed at the table after he left, looking at the documents without touching them. Renato watched her with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to trust a variable. You didn't know, he said. Not a question. About my father's involvement with any of this? No. She looked up at him. About the trafficking. I didn't know. If I had... She stopped. There wasn't a sentence that finished that properly, so she left it. Renato gathered the documents slowly. For what it's worth, your father's communication record suggests he was trying to get out of the arrangement for the last 2 years. The partnership was forced, initially. Old agreements, old debts. By the time he understood what Meridian Freight actually was, he was already implicated. That doesn't exonerate him. No, Renato agreed. It doesn't. Sophia stood. Her legs felt slightly unsteady, which she registered with irritation and addressed by locking her knees and standing straight. Where is Luciano likely to go right now? Renato considered her for a moment. North stairwell, rooftop access. When he needs to think, he goes up. She left the room. The roof of the former cathedral was a flat expanse of old tar and gravel, bordered by a low stone parapet that had partially crumbled in 2 corners. The morning was cold, and the sky was a uniform gray pressing down on the city, and Luciano was standing at the north edge with both hands on the parapet and his back to the door when Sofia pushed it open. He didn't turn around. "Renato told you." I asked. The wind up here was considerable. It moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back and crossed the rooftop to stand beside him. Not close, just within speaking range, looking out at the city the same direction he was. Below them, Chicago conducted its ordinary morning with absolute indifference to everything happening inside this building. "Say what you came up here to say," Luciano said. "I didn't come up here to say anything specific." She paused. "I came up here because you just learned your brother died trying to do something decent, and someone in your organization killed him for it, and I didn't think you should be alone with that." Something shifted in the line of his shoulders, not softening, more like the specific tension of a man holding something very tightly. "You're being remarkably humane," he said, "toward the person who abducted you." "Yes, I'm aware of the irony." Silence. A distant siren somewhere in the city below. "I owe you," he started. "You owe me a great many things," Sofia said. "We can discuss the accounting later. Right now I'm asking you a different question." She turned to look at his profile. "Do you believe it? All of it? The documents? The intercepts? Do you believe Vittorio didn't order Matteo's death?" Luciano was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the rooftop and pulled at his jacket. "My gut said Vittorio was guilty," he said finally. "The moment I heard Matteo was dead, it said Vittorio. 20 years of antagonism, and it said him immediately." He exhaled through his nose. "But Matteo's file on the logistics discrepancy, Renato found the original, the handwriting, the notations. That's Matteo's work. He was meticulous," he paused. "He found something real, and someone killed him before he could bring it to me directly. Someone who knew he was coming to you." "Yes. Who knew your brother well enough to intercept his movements." Luciano's hands tightened on the parapet. "Yes." Sofia let that sit for a moment. "Luciano." He turned his head at the sound of his name in her mouth. She'd used it twice now. Once in the dark when he was bleeding, once just now. And each time it seemed to register differently than he expected it to, like a word he'd always heard from a distance that was now being spoken directly to him. "This person is still inside your organization," she said. "I know. Which means every move you make to investigate this, they'll know." "I know that too." "Then what are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. The cold air was in his face, and the composure was not entirely back yet, and she could still see the thing beneath it, the fracture that the last 48 hours had opened up, running from somewhere very old. "I'm going to find them," he said, "and I'm going to dismantle everything connected to Meridian Freight. The politicians, the prosecutor, the network. All of it." He paused. "And I'm going to need documentation I can actually hand to someone with federal authority, because I can't go to war against sitting senators on my word alone. You'd go to the FBI. I'd go to the right FBI. Whitmore is compromised. There are others." Sofia looked at him carefully. "That would expose your own organization." "Yes." "It would end you. What you've built here." "Yes." She held his gaze. "Is that what you want?" Luciano looked back out at the city. Something in his face made a decision that his voice hadn't caught up to yet. "What I want," he said slowly, "stopped being the point somewhere in the last 48 hours. I'm not entirely sure when." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't close to one. But Sofia heard what was underneath it, and she was quiet for a moment because it required a moment. "I need to contact my father," she said, "through whatever channel he used to transmit the documents. There's more in that archives. The partial records Renato has aren't enough for a federal case. Vittorio kept the most damaging material separate as leverage." She paused. "He'll give it to me. He won't give it to you. Not directly." Luciano studied her with an expression that was not trust. Not yet, not fully, but was something adjacent to it, some early form of it that was more honest for not pretending to be more than it was. "You'd do that." "I'd do that." "Why?" Sophia thought about her father's 3 words. He's sorry. She thought about what Renato had said. Forced partnership, old debts, years trying to get out. She thought about Matteo DeMarco dying in an alley for trying to do something right. Because those women deserve better than 2 criminal organizations protecting their own interests, she said, and because I've been passive about what my family name meant for too long. She paused. And because I'm still here. I keep staying. I'm starting to accept that that means something. Luciano was quiet for a long time. I'll have Enzo set up a secure channel, he said finally. Your communications with Vittorio go through me. Nothing hidden. Agreed. And Sophia. He held her gaze with something that was trying to be straightforward and finding it difficult. What I did, the 11 days, He stopped. His jaw worked. There's no, she said. There isn't. Not releasing him from it, just confirming the fact. But we have more important things to deal with right now, so. She turned and walked back to the rooftop door. Behind her, she heard him exhale, long and ragged, and very human. The next 4 days were the most dangerous kind of busy, purposeful, careful, and full of things that could go wrong in ways that wouldn't announce themselves until they already had. Enzo established a secure communication line through a routing system that Vittorio's people had apparently used for months. Sophia's first contact with her father lasted 11 minutes, and she conducted it alone in the intelligence room with Luciano present, but not participating, sitting at the far end of the table with his eyes on a different screen, honoring the arrangement they'd made. Vittorio's voice on the encrypted line sounded older than she remembered, thinner, like something structural in him had given way. Sofina, he said, her childhood name. She hadn't heard it in years. I'm alive, she said. Not warm, not cold, just accurate. I know, I don't want to talk about what you've been, Papa. Not yet. She kept her voice level. I want the rest of the archive, the primary documentation, the financial records that directly implicate Crane and Whitmore. A long pause. How do you know about... Renato cracked the partial files. Another pause, longer. You're working with DeMarco. I'm working on this. DeMarco is in the same room. That's the situation. She heard her father breathe. Sophia, I know what he is, she said. I also know what you are. And I know what the men running Meridian Freight are. Right now, the last category is the one that matters. She waited. The files, Papa. Vittorio sent the files. Yes, the expanded archive detonated quietly inside the compound like something that had been waiting a long time to go off. Senator Harold Crane's name appeared across 17 transactions spanning 6 years. Prosecutor Douglas Whitmore had signed off on redirected federal investigations on no fewer than 9 occasions. The 2 aldermen had provided zoning and logistics cover for 4 of Meridian Freight's Chicago transit facilities. The total financial transfer was in the range of $40 million over the life of the arrangement. And buried in the deepest layer of the archive, encrypted separately from everything else, a list of names, not politicians, not criminals. 41 names with dates and transit records and a designation code that Renato, when he translated it, sat back in his chair and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Victims, he said finally. Documented victims who were successfully tracked and identified. Vittorio's people had a network that was trying to intercept and document Meridian's operations from the inside. He looked at the list. He was building a case. For 4 years, Luciano said. Yes. 41 names. That they could document. The real number? Renato didn't finish the sentence. Luciano stood with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, and his face doing something that he wasn't controlling the way he usually controlled it. And Sophia, across the room, watched him absorb this and said nothing because nothing was the right thing to say. It was Enzo who broke the silence, and what he said cracked the room open in a different direction entirely. Marco wants a meeting. Luciano's eyes moved to him immediately. When did he contact us? This morning, private line. Enzo's voice was carefully neutral. He says he's been out of contact because of the attack. He went to ground when the compound was hit. He wants to convene the senior members at the Halstead property tomorrow night, discuss security and next steps. Marco DeMarco was Luciano's uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who had taught him to play chess and to drive and to read a room, who had sat across from him the night his father died and said quietly, "You're the head of this now. I'll be right behind you." For 22 years, he had been right behind him. Luciano looked at the list of senior members with access to his private correspondence that Renato had compiled on the first morning. Marco's name was on it. It had been on it since the beginning, and Luciano had looked at it and looked away because some things your brain refuses to complete the circuit on until there's enough current running through it that you don't have a choice. "Tell him I'll be there," Luciano said. Enzo hesitated, almost imperceptibly. "You're sure?" "Yes." After Enzo left, the room was quiet again. Renato busied himself at the far end of the table with the kind of focused attention that meant he had understood what had just happened and was making himself invisible around it. Sofia was watching Luciano. He was looking at the wall above the document table, so not at anything specific on it, just at a point in the middle distance where thoughts go when they're too heavy to finish. "Marco," she said quietly, "I don't know. His name is on the access list. I know his name is on the list." His voice came out harder than he'd aimed for. He caught it, recalibrated. "Half the senior organization is on the list. Proximity to me isn't evidence." "No," Sofia said, "it isn't." She paused. "But you already think it's him." Luciano's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "I'm not asking you to say it out loud," she said. "I'm asking you to be careful. If it is him, he already knows the attack failed. He already knows you survived. He'll be calculating his next move. Which is why I'm going to the meeting. Which is why going to the meeting might be exactly what he wants." Luciano looked at her. Not with anger, with something more complicated, the specific friction of a man who knows someone is right and hasn't finished deciding what to do with that knowledge. "What would you do?" he said. Not rhetorical, actually asking. Sofia considered it. "I'd send someone you trust completely, not the senior circle, someone outside it, to surveil the Halstead property before the meeting. I'd verify who's already there and why." She paused. "And I'd go anyway, because you have to, but I'd know what I was walking into." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've never been in this world," he said. "How do you think like this?" "I grew up watching my father from a distance," she said. "You observe the mechanics without being inside them. Sometimes you see the shape more clearly from outside." Luciano was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Enzo." Enzo reappeared in the doorway immediately. "Get me Caruso, not through the main channels, personal line only." Luciano's voice had recovered its full flatness. Decision made, execution beginning. "Tell him I need eyes on Halstead by tonight." Enzo was already moving. The next 20 hours were the kind of hours that leave marks. Sofia worked alongside Renato through the afternoon and into the evening, building a documentation package, organized, cross-referenced, with legal summaries that someone with federal authority could actually use. She had no legal training, but she had a researcher's instincts and a thesis writer's understanding of how to structure an argument from primary sources, and Renato had the criminal intelligence context she lacked, and together they produced something that was cleaner and more usable than either of them could have managed alone. Luciano moved through the compound in a different register than before, quieter, more contained. He came into the intelligence room twice, once to review the documentation package, once to listen to Caruso's preliminary report from the Halstead property, which confirmed that 2 of the men supposedly coming to the meeting were already on site and had been there since the previous night. One of them was Marco's personal driver. He listened to the report without expression. Then he went back to his room. Sofia went looking for him at 11 that night and found him in the corridor outside the intelligence room, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees up and a glass of scotch in his hand that he'd barely touched. His tie was gone. The top buttons of his shirt were open. The sling was off. Dr. Ferrante had cleared him for limited movement, and his shoulder was clearly hurting him, the set of his body angled slightly to protect it. He looked up when she appeared. Didn't say anything. Sophia sat down on the floor across from him, which was not something she had planned to do, but the corridor was empty and the compound was quiet, and it was the right thing. "He used to take me fishing," Luciano said after a while. His voice was very low. "Marco. Every summer when I was a kid, before everything changed. A lake about 40 miles outside the city. He'd wake me up at 4 in the morning, and we'd drive out there in his old truck, and he'd teach me to be patient." A short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Patience, of all things. Sophia said nothing. "Let it have room." "He sat across from me the night my father was buried," Luciano continued, "looked me in the eye and said he'd be behind me no matter what, that the family name meant something, that Matteo and I were everything." He stopped. His jaw tightened. He was lying even then. He was already in it even then. "You don't know that yet," Sophia said carefully. "I know enough." She looked at him, at the tattooed hands and the scotch and the open shirt and the very old grief sitting in his face that the composure usually buried so thoroughly you couldn't see it existed. It existed. It was right there, in the open, in a corridor at 11 at night with the compound quiet around them. "Luciano," she said. He looked at her. "If it is him, when you know for certain, what are you going to do?" The question sat in the air between them. He looked at the scotch in his hand. "What I have to do. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now." Sophia studied him. "The man who walked up to that roof this morning and said dismantling all of it was the right thing. He was telling the truth?" "Yes." "Then what you have to do," she said carefully, "might not be what you've always done." He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between resistance and recognition. A man being told something his body already knows and his history doesn't want to accept. "That's a significant adjustment," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at the floor for a long time, then, "Stay for the Halstead meeting. I want you in the building." "Why?" "Because you see the shape more clearly from outside." He looked up at her. "And because He stopped. The sentence seemed to genuinely surprise him from the inside. He looked at her with something that was exposed and almost angry about being exposed. "Because I think better when you're in the room. I don't know what that means yet, and I don't entirely like it, but it's the truth." Sophia held his gaze. Something moved in her chest that she noted and set aside for later, because later was safer than now. "All right," she said. "I'll be there." She stood, looked down at him. "Get some sleep," she said. "You're still losing color when you move too fast." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You were shot 3 days ago." She paused at the corner. "Get some sleep, Luciano." She turned and walked away down the corridor. Behind her, she heard him exhale once, long and slow. She heard the sound of him getting to his feet. She did not look back. The meeting at the Halstead property was scheduled for 8 the following evening. At 6:15, Caruso's second report came in. Sophia was in the intelligence room when Enzo read it aloud in a voice stripped of everything except the words, because the words were enough. Marco DeMarco had arrived at the property at 4 in the afternoon, 6 hours before the announced meeting time. He had brought 11 men. He had overseen the installation of a secondary surveillance system covering the property's 3 vehicle entrances. And he had received a phone call, intercepted and partially reconstructed by Caruso's technical support, from a number that cross-referenced to a burner registered to Douglas Whitmore's office. The call lasted 4 minutes. The only fragment Caruso's team had successfully reconstructed was 6 words from Marco's side of the conversation. "He'll come. He always comes." The room was very quiet. Luciano stood at the head of the table with both hands flat on the surface and his eyes moving across the report with the slowness of a man reading something he already knew was there and finding no relief in confirmation. Sophia watched his face. She watched the moment the last door closed, the one that had still been, until now, the thinnest possibility of being wrong, the one that opened onto the version of events where Marco was still the man who woke a boy at 4 in the morning to teach him patience at a lake 40 miles outside the city. She watched Luciano's face when that door closed, and she understood, looking at it, that what came next would be irrevocable, that the man walking into Halstead tonight would not walk out as the same thing that walked in, that some transformations only go one direction and some betrayals, the ones by the people who held you when you were small, the ones by the people who looked you in the eye over your father's grave. Those ones don't leave room for the person you were before you knew. Luciano straightened up. He looked at Enzo. "Call the meeting," he said. "Tell Marco I'm coming." His voice was flat and completely empty of everything except what he needed it to carry. "Tell him I'm bringing 4 men." Enzo nodded, picked up the phone. Luciano looked at Sofia across the table. The look lasted 3 seconds and contained, in those 3 seconds, everything he wasn't going to say in this room with these people present. The complexity of what she had become to him in 11 days of captivity and 3 days of impossible renegotiation, the thing that was growing in the space between what he'd done to her and what she kept doing anyway. The specific terror of a man who has spent his adult life building walls, discovering that one of them has already come down without his permission. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Enzo and said, "We leave in 90 minutes." And Sofia, watching him turn toward the door, felt the floor shift beneath the whole architecture of what the next hours would bring. Felt it in the way you feel a structural change before you can name it, in the tightening of the air and the way everyone in the room seemed to breathe slightly differently. Because some nights announce themselves before they arrive, and this one was already... The drive to Halstead took 22 minutes through Chicago's evening traffic, and Luciano spent all of it in silence in the back seat of the lead vehicle, with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes on the city moving past the window. Enzo drove. 2 additional vehicles followed, 4 men each, armed, instructed to hold their positions outside the property perimeter unless they received a specific signal. Sofia was in the second vehicle. Luciano had not argued when she got in. He'd looked at her once, standing beside the car in the compound's interior courtyard, with her jacket on and her face composed with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and finished making it, and he'd said nothing, and she'd gotten in. The Halstead property was a converted warehouse on the near west side that the DeMarco organization had used for meetings for 15 years. Neutral ground by convention, large enough to accommodate a full senior gathering, familiar enough that everyone knew its exits and its blind spots. Which, Luciano was thinking as they turned onto the street, meant Marco knew them too. Had known them for 15 years. Had walked every inch of this building with Luciano at his side. He knew exactly where a man would feel safe and exactly where that feeling would be wrong. "Caruso's people are on the roof," Enzo said quietly. "I see them." Luciano's eyes moved to the roofline as they pulled up, catching the barely visible outline of a figure at the northeast corner. "Stay with the car until I signal." "Luciano, stay with the car, Enzo." He got out. The interior of the warehouse smelled like it always had, concrete and machine oil and the faint metallic undertone of a space that held a lot of men on a regular basis. The lighting was industrial, yellow-white, and unsparing. Long tables had been arranged in a rough rectangle in the central space, and 7 men were already seated when Luciano walked in, with Marco DeMarco at the far end standing with a glass of red wine and the specific quality of a man performing ease. He was 61 years old, compact and gray-haired, with the broad hands of someone who had done physical work before the organization swallowed everything. He had Luciano's father's eyes, a family trait, dark and direct, and he was using them now with the warmth of reunion, arms spreading slightly as Luciano crossed the floor toward him. "Luca," he said. The childhood diminutive, a thing deployed carefully with the skill of a man who knew exactly what it cost and what it bought. Luciano stopped 8 feet from him. He didn't take the extended hand. Marco's expression shifted. Not collapsed, just recalibrated. The smile staying, but the warmth behind it making a micro-adjustment that only someone who knew his face very well would catch. Luciano had known his face for 36 years. He caught it. "You look terrible," Marco said. "Sit down. Tell me about the attack. We've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Nobody knew." "Who told the Salazar cartel about the cathedral compound?" Luciano said. The room went quiet, the specific way rooms go quiet, when something that was below the surface comes above it suddenly and completely. Marco looked at him. His expression did something careful. "What are you asking me?" I'm asking who gave them the location, the personnel count, and the timing of the shift change. Luciano's voice had no elevation in it, flat as a road. Because that's what they had. They hit us with that precision. Someone gave them the blueprint. Luciano, Marco's voice dropped into something avuncular and concerned. You've been through an attack. You've been shot. You've been... The Valenti archive, Luciano said. Renato broke it. A pause. Shorter than it should have been. I heard Vittorio sent documents, Marco said. Misinformation, Luca. Classic Valenti play. He's trying to fracture us from the inside while he runs. You can't trust 41 names, Luciano said. Documented victims. 4 years of evidence. Senator Crane, Prosecutor Whitmore, Meridian Freight. He watched Marco's face while he said each name, watched the specific stillness that replaced the performance of surprise. My brother found the ledger and came to you. The silence was absolute. He came to you, Luciano said again, because he didn't know who else to trust inside the organization, because you were the one he'd trusted his whole life. The flatness in his voice had developed an edge that wasn't volume, just density. And you killed him. Marco set down his wine glass. The men seated around the table had gone very still, some of them genuinely blindsided, some of them, Luciano now understood, waiting to see which way this broke so they could position accordingly. He cataloged their faces in a rapid sweep and noted 3 who were watching Marco specifically, not him. 3 who had known, who were wondering if the calculation still held. Matteo was going to destroy everything, Marco said. The words came out without preamble, without performance, just fact, offered with a practicality that was somehow more obscene than rage would have been. He was 28 years old and he thought he understood what this organization was, what you have to do to maintain power in this city. Marco's voice was steady, the voice of a man explaining an obvious thing to someone who should already understand it. He found one piece of one arrangement and he was ready to burn 20 years of work to the ground because it offended his conscience. He paused. His conscience. In this business. He was trying to stop a trafficking operation, Luciano said. He was going to hand us to the federal government. He was your nephew. He was a liability. Marco said it the way you say the sky is gray. I did what the organization required. I did what your father would have done. The last sentence landed like something physical. Luciano felt it hit somewhere in the center of his chest and detonate quietly. He stood very still with the detonation happening inside him and his face showing nothing, because if it showed anything, he would lose whatever came next, and he could not lose what came next. My father, he said, would not have touched Matteo. Your father, Marco said, and now something had shifted in his voice, a thin current of something that might have been contempt held under pressure for a very long time, was sentimental. It was his greatest weakness. It is yours. He looked at Luciano with the eyes Luciano had known his whole life, and in them now was something that had apparently always been there and had simply been covered by 40 years of practice proximity. You are exactly like him, brilliant and compromised and unable to make the hard choice when it involves someone you love. And the girl, one of the seated men said quietly. Sal Damiano, 50 years old, the organization's financial controller, and one of the 3 Luciano had identified as complicit. Bringing her here, working with Valenti's daughter, sharing intelligence with her. He shook his head slightly. Marco said you'd do it. I didn't believe him. Luciano looked at Damiano, then back at Marco. You've been waiting for this, Luciano said. The attack on the compound wasn't random. You gave Salazar the location to destabilize us, and when I survived, you called this meeting. He looked at the 3 complicit men and then back at Marco. You've been building toward replacing me. Marco's expression didn't change. I've been building toward keeping the organization alive. By killing my brother. By removing an obstacle. By handing women and girls to Meridian Freight. For the first time, something flickered in Marco's face. Not guilt, nothing so clean as that, but a recalibration, a reading of the room, Of the 5 men present who had not known the full scope of what Meridian was and were now absorbing it in real time. Marco had overestimated how much that information could be contained in a room of people who had spent their lives calculating loyalty against evidence. He had made a mistake. Luciano saw him realize it half a second before Marco moved. "Take him," Marco said. It happened fast and wrong. The 3 complicit men came up from the table, and the 2 men Luciano had brought inside reached for their weapons, and someone fired, and the warehouse exploded into chaos. That was nothing like the clean tactical engagement it was supposed to be. It was close and brutal and completely tangled, bodies colliding in a space with too many obstacles and not enough room to establish any distance. Luciano moved toward Marco instinctively, and something connected with the side of his head. A pistol grip swung by Damiano, and the room tilted sharply to the left, and he went down to one knee on the concrete, stars fracturing his vision, the wound in his shoulder sending a fresh wave of white pain through his entire right side. He heard the signal shots, 2 fast reports from outside that meant Enzo was breaching. He heard someone shout Marco's name. He got his feet back under him. Marco was gone. The door to the north corridor, the one that led to the building's loading dock, the one with direct access to a rear vehicle exit that Luciano himself had identified years ago as the best emergency egress from this property, was swinging closed. Luciano went after him. The corridor was long and badly lit, and his head was not entirely right. The blow from Damiano had done something to his balance that he was managing through will rather than function, one hand on the wall as he moved, shoulder screaming, the sound of the fight behind him receding as he pushed deeper into the building. He came through the loading dock door, and the cold night air hit him like a correction. Marco was at the rear vehicle exit, 30 feet away, reaching for the door handle of a waiting black SUV whose engine was already running. "Marco!" His uncle stopped, turned. In the yellow flood of the exterior light, they looked at each other across 30 feet of oil-stained concrete. The man who had raised him in the aftermath of his father's death, and the man who had ordered his brother's throat opened in an alley off South Wabash, and framed another family for it, and used the resulting war as cover for 4 years of organizational positioning. Marco looked at him with those eyes, his father's eyes, the family's eyes. "You're not going to shoot me," Marco said. Luciano had his weapon raised. His hand was steady despite the shoulder, despite the blow, despite the fact that the world was still oscillating slightly at the edges of his vision. "You're not," Marco said again, "because I raised you, because somewhere under all of this, you're still the boy who cried at that lake when his first fish died and threw it back in, hoping the water would fix it." His voice was not cruel. That was the terrible part. It was almost gentle. "You don't have the capacity for this, Luca. You never did. It's why Matteo had to die instead of simply being handled, because you would have protected him, and it would have cost everything." Luciano's finger was on the trigger. He stood there for 3 full seconds. And then the SUV's rear door opened from inside and 2 men came out fast, and the calculation changed in the specific way calculations change when the geometry shifts without warning, and Luciano dove left behind the concrete barrier as the first shots came, and when he came back up, Marco's SUV was already through the exit gate and gone into the Chicago night. Matam. He sat on the loading dock concrete for approximately 90 seconds. His head was clearing. The shoulder was a sustained and serious problem. He did an inventory. Nothing else broken. One graze along his left forearm that he hadn't felt happen and was now registering as a thin line of fire. Enzo appeared at the loading dock door with 2 men and a specific expression. "Damiano?" Luciano said. "Detained. 2 of the others are down. The rest—" Enzo stopped. Marco got out. "Yes." He had a vehicle waiting. "Yes." Luciano stood up. The world stayed where it was supposed to be mostly. The men who didn't know, Ferretti, Bianchi, the others, where are they? Inside, shaken, waiting. "They're not complicit. I saw their faces when Meridian came up." Luciano touched the side of his head where Damiano had hit him, and his fingers came away with a thin smear of blood. "Nobody leaves the property. I need to talk to them." "Luciano." Enzo's voice had something in it. There's a problem. The quality of those 3 words made Luciano go still. What? Enzo didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. What, Enzo? The compound. Enzo's jaw tightened. 20 minutes ago. Marco's people, a separate team, they were already in position. They came in through the west access while we were here. He met Luciano's eyes. They took Sofia. The drive back to the compound took 8 minutes because Enzo drove it in 8 minutes, and Luciano sat in the passenger seat with his weapon in his hand and his mind doing the thing it did under extreme pressure, going very cold and very precise, clearing everything that wasn't immediately functional, reducing the world to its operating components. Marco had split the operation. The meeting at Halstead was half of it. Draw Luciano out, either kill him or scatter his inner circle. Take control of the organization's senior structure. The other half was the compound. A simultaneous action. 2 objectives prosecuted in parallel. He had anticipated that Luciano would survive the meeting, or he hadn't cared whether he did, because the second objective was Sofia. Luciano understood, with the specific cold clarity of a man whose mind has just completed a calculation it didn't want to complete, what Sofia represented to Marco. She wasn't leverage against Vittorio Valenti anymore. She was leverage against Luciano himself. And Marco, who had known Luciano for 36 years and had been watching him for the last 11 days with the careful attention of a man preparing a final move, had seen exactly what she had become. The compound was a controlled disaster when they arrived. West Wing breached, 2 guards down, the intelligence room ransacked. Renato had barricaded himself in the lower level with the documentation archive, and was intact and furious. Dr. Ferrante had a split lip and was cataloging the damage with professional detachment. 4 of the compound's guards were unaccounted for. Luciano walked through the east corridor to Sofia's room. The door was open. The cot was overturned. Her French paperback was on the floor, spine broken, pages splayed. It had fallen or been knocked there in whatever happened. Her jacket was gone, which meant she'd been wearing it, which meant it hadn't been instantaneous. He stood in the doorway of the room he'd kept her locked in for 11 days and looked at the broken book on the floor and felt something move through him that was not cold and not precise and not functional. Something hot and old and deep that he didn't have a clean name for because he'd spent 20 years making sure he never had to name it. He picked up the book, set it on the cot. Caruso is running the extraction team's vehicle signature, Enzo said from behind him. We'll have a location within... Luciano's phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He answered. You should have taken the shot, Marco said. His uncle's voice was calm and slightly muffled. A vehicle, moving, windows partly open. Luciano could hear Chicago traffic in the background. He ran a calculation on that, filed it. Where is she? Somewhere comfortable, for now. A pause. She's an interesting young woman, Luca. I can see why you've complicated yourself over her. She looked at my men when they came in, and the first thing she did was try to negotiate. Not scream, not run. A sound that might have been appreciation. Valenti's daughter, after all. If you touch her, the terms are simple, Marco said. The documentation archive, everything Vittorio transmitted, everything Renato has compiled, you destroy it. All of it. Copies, backups, everything, verified by someone I trust. You stand down from any federal contact. You step back from the organization's day-to-day operations and allow a restructured leadership to take over. A pause. You do that and the girl goes home. Unharmed. You have my word. Luciano said nothing. The word of a man who killed your brother, Marco said, with the specific awareness of someone who understood exactly what he was offering and what it was worth, is still the word of a man who knows that dead hostages end negotiations. She's worth more to me breathing and intact. Give me 12 hours, Luciano said. You have 6. Marco ended the call. Chasm. Luciano stood in the middle of the compound's main space with his phone in his hand and the organization's surviving leadership watching him from various positions around the room. Enzo closest, Renato appearing from the lower level with his reading glasses still on his forehead and the look of a man processing rapidly, Ferretti and Bianchi and the others from the Halstead meeting who had been brought back under escort and were now in the complicated position of men whose loyalties had just been redistributed by events. He looked at all of them. "I need to know," he said, "right now, who in this room is with Marco. Not accusation, information. If you're with him, step out. No consequences tonight. I need to know the actual shape of this." Silence. Nobody moved. He looked at each face, read them. Ferretti was scared but present. Bianchi was angry in the productive direction. The others ranged from shaken to resolved. "All right," Luciano said. "Sit down." They sat. He stood. "Marco has the Valenti girl," he said. "He wants the documentation archive destroyed and organizational control transferred. He's given us 6 hours. He paused. "I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is find her, get her out, and then finish what Renato's documentation makes possible. Hand every name in that archive to federal investigators with the authority and the inclination to chase it." He looked around the room. "That ends this organization as it currently exists. I know that. You need to know I know that, and that I've made the decision anyway." The room was very quiet. "Some of you have been with this organization for 20 years, Luciano continued. Some of you have families. Exposure in a federal investigation carries risk. I can't control for you. I can try to structure the cooperation to minimize culpability for people who weren't involved in Meridian, but I can't promise outcomes." He paused. "So if you need to walk away tonight, walk away. I'm not holding anyone here. But if you stay, I need everything you have." He waited. Enzo, who had not sat down, said, "Where do you want me?" Ferretti said, "What do you need?" Bianchi said nothing, just nodded once, the specific nod of a man who has finished his internal calculation. Renato pushed his glasses down onto his nose and opened his laptop. "Caruso has a vehicle signature. I'm working on the location now." Luciano looked at all of them. Something settled in his chest. Not peace, nothing like peace. More like the specific solidity of a man who has finally put down something very heavy and discovered with surprise that his hands still work. "Renato," he said, "how long for a location?" 90 minutes, maybe less." "Do it in 60. He turned to Enzo. "Get Caruso's full team. I want tactical planning in the lower level in 45 minutes. To Ferretti, I need a federal contact, not Whitmore. Not anyone Whitmore could have reached. Someone clean." "You have a name?" Ferretti thought for 3 seconds. "My brother-in-law's old partner, retired FBI, now private sector, but his contacts in the Chicago field office are—" "Get him on the phone, tonight." He looked at the room one more time. Then he went to the intelligence room, sat down at the table, and picked up the slim French paperback he'd carried from Sophia's room without consciously deciding to. He set it on the table in front of him. Looked at it. She'd been working on a thesis about Flemish manuscript illumination. She'd translated Latin passages in the dark to keep herself sane. She'd apologized to the guards who brought her food. She'd run toward him instead of away when the compound was under fire. She'd saved his life twice, and he had put her, by every decision he'd made in the last 11 days, directly into the hands of a man who had killed his own nephew without compunction because the boy's conscience was an inconvenience. Luciano put both hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. The documentation in Renato's archive was the most powerful tool he'd ever held. It could bring down a senator, a federal prosecutor, a trafficking network, 2 corrupt aldermen. It could dismantle in a single federal case what 20 years of criminal rivalry had never touched. And Marco knew that Luciano valued Sofia more than the archive, which was the trap. Because if he moved to extract Sofia, he showed his hand. Marco would know where his people were, how many, their approach. He had informants. The organizational breach that had enabled the compound attack meant he had eyes somewhere inside the remaining structure. Any tactical movement toward Sofia's location could be anticipated, and if he destroyed the archive to meet Marco's terms, the documentation died. The women on that list stayed phantoms. Crane and Whitmore continued operating. Meridian Freight continued moving. Both options cost something irreplaceable. Luciano sat with that for 60 seconds. 60 seconds of complete stillness with the French paperback in front of him and the compound moving around him and 6 hours counting down in his blood. Then his phone rang again. Different unknown number, different area code. He answered. "Mr. DeMarco?" A woman's voice. Controlled, precise, with the flat Midwestern vowels of someone who had spent a long time in institutional settings. "My name is Special Agent Christine Hale, FBI Chicago. I'm calling because a man named Vittorio Valenti contacted our office 3 hours ago with documentation regarding Senator Harold Crane and a trafficking network operating under the name Meridian Freight." A pause. "He told us you have the original archive. He told us what it contains, and he told us something else." Luciano was very still. "He told us," Agent Hale said, "that his daughter is missing. And he told us that the man who has her is the same man who ordered the death of Matteo DeMarco and who has been obstructing federal investigations into Meridian for 4 years." Another pause. "I'm not calling to threaten you, Mr. DeMarco. I'm calling because Vittorio Valenti told me something I found interesting." "What?" "He said you were the one person left in your organization that Matteo trusted." Her voice was even and without judgment. "And that if there was any version of this that ended with his daughter alive and the people running Meridian in federal custody, it ran through you." A pause that was precisely as long as it needed to be. "So I'm asking, is there a version of this that runs through you?" Luciano looked at the French paperback. He looked at it for a long time. Outside the intelligence room, he could hear Enzo organizing the tactical team. He could hear Renato running the vehicle trace. He could hear the compound operating around him with the sounds of men who had made their decision and were moving. He thought about a lake 40 miles outside the city and a gray-haired man teaching a boy patience at 4 in the morning. He thought about his brother's handwriting in the margins of a logistics discrepancy report, meticulous and careful, doing the right thing in the only way he knew how. He thought about Sophia on the rooftop saying, "Those women deserve better than 2 criminal organizations protecting their own interests." "Yes," Luciano said into the phone. "There's a version, but I need something from you first." "What?" "My people move on the location tonight, independent of your team. You stay back until we have Sofia Valenti out of the building. After that, the building is yours, the documentation is yours, and I will personally walk you through every transaction in the archive." He paused. "But she comes out first, before anything else." A pause on the other end. He heard paper moving, heard the quality of a decision being made. "Agreed," Agent Hale said, "with one condition." "What?" "Marco DeMarco does not die tonight, Mr. DeMarco. He stands trial. He testifies. He is the thread that pulls the entire network apart, and a dead man can't testify." The silence stretched. It was the hardest thing she could have asked for, and she knew it and asked for it anyway. Luciano closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, opened them. "Agreed," he said. He ended the call. He sat for one more moment in the intelligence room with the French paperback and the weight of what the next hours would require, not just tactically, not just physically, but in the specific interior way that some agreements cost you something you can never recover, and you make them anyway because the alternative is becoming the thing you most. Renato had the location in 53 minutes. A cold storage facility in Bridgeport, 7 minutes from the Halstead property, which told Luciano that Marco had chosen it in advance, had it prepared and waiting before the meeting, had walked into Halstead tonight with every contingency already in place. The vehicle signature matched a refrigerated logistics company that cross-referenced, when Renato ran it, to a shell company 3 layers removed from a Meridian Freight subsidiary. Marco had been hiding his secondary infrastructure inside the trafficking network's own logistics chain, using their cover to cover himself. The architecture of it was elegant and deeply sick, and Luciano filed both observations and moved on. The tactical briefing lasted 18 minutes. Caruso ran it with the clipped precision of a former military man who had spent 15 years in private security and had no patience for anything that wasn't operationally necessary. The facility had 2 main entry points, a loading dock on the south face and a fire exit on the east wall that the building permit showed but that the current operators had apparently sealed, which Caruso flagged as a likely ambush point, something that looked like an exit and wasn't. Thermal imaging from a drone Caruso's team had deployed 20 minutes earlier showed 11 heat signatures inside. 4 clustered near what appeared to be a central office space on the ground floor, 3 near the south entry, 2 at the north, and 2 isolated in a smaller room on the east side of the building. 2 isolated signatures. The smaller room, Luciano said. Most likely, Caruso said. Dimensions consistent with a site office or break room, single door, interior. Luciano looked at the thermal image. The 2 signatures were close together, one stationary, one moving slightly, a slow, restless movement that could be pacing. He thought about Sophia pacing the dimensions of the sacristy room, calculating volume, translating manuscripts in her head. He thought about her doing that in a cold storage facility in Bridgeport while Marco's men stood outside the door. South entry is the primary breach point, Luciano said. Full contact, maximum noise. I want their attention completely south. He traced the route on the building plan. 4-man team through the loading dock simultaneous with the south entry breach. Caruso takes the north with 2. I go for the east office room. Alone, Enzo said. With you. That's 2 people going through the center of 11 armed men. It's 2 people going through the noise of a breach hitting 2 simultaneous entry points, Luciano said. Different thing. He looked at Enzo. You know this building type. You know how men position when they hear a breach? They move toward the sound. They don't hold static positions. We have approximately 40 seconds of reorientation on their part. He paused. That's enough. Enzo looked at the building plan for 3 seconds. 40 seconds, he said. Yes. Your shoulder is fine. It's been shot. 3 days ago. It's fine. Luciano held his gaze. Are you with me? Enzo picked up his weapon from the table, checked it, racked it. I'm with you. Luciano turned to Renato. The archive? Everything. You have it secured? External drive encrypted, copy uploaded to a secure server Agent Hale gave me credentials for. Yes. If this goes wrong tonight, that material reaches Hale regardless. Her team has the building after we extract Sophia. She knows the terms. Understood. Luciano looked at the room, at the men who had stayed, at Ferretti checking his weapon with the focused calm of a man who had made his peace with the night's requirements, at Bianchi near the door, running a hand over his face with the exhaustion of someone who has burned through adrenaline twice already and is now operating on something older and more basic. At Caruso's team, 6 men who were professionals in the specific way that meant they'd stopped asking questions about the larger picture and were entirely inside the operational present. We move in 20, Luciano said. The drive to Bridgeport was 11 minutes in the end because of a freight truck stalled on the expressway that added 4 minutes and made Luciano's jaw tighten in a way he didn't let become anything more than that. He sat in the passenger seat with his weapon in his lap and his phone face down on his thigh and his eyes on the road ahead. Enzo drove without speaking. They had been in enough of these together that silence wasn't absence. It was the shared interior space of 2 men who knew what was on the other side of the next few minutes and had nothing useful left to say about it. Luciano thought about the agreement with Agent Hale. Marco does not die tonight. He had said the word and he had meant it at the time, and he meant it now, with the specific effort of a man who means something against the grain of everything he feels. Marco would stand in a federal courtroom, would testify, would be the thread that unraveled a senator and a prosecutor and a trafficking network and everything connected to it. That was the outcome that mattered. That was the outcome Sophia had been working toward from the moment she sat down in that intelligence room and started building a documentation package with the precision of someone who understood that evidence was the only weapon that couldn't be confiscated. He would honor the agreement. He would honor it regardless of what Marco said tonight, regardless of what he saw in those eyes, his father's eyes, the family's eyes, the eyes of the man who had taught him patience at a lake and then ordered his brother killed in an alley. He would honor it because Sophia would ask him to, and because she would be right, and because he was trying, with the grinding difficulty of a man dismantling something he built himself, to be the version of himself she'd seen from the beginning when he couldn't see it at all. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. No message, just a timestamp. Marco, reminding him the clock was running. 4 hours and 20 minutes left of the 6-hour window. He put the phone face down again. 2 minutes, Enzo said. I know. They staged 3 blocks from the facility, vehicles dark, engine off, the Chicago night sitting cold and chemical smelling around them with the specific ambiance of an industrial neighborhood at midnight, distant highway noise, a dog somewhere, the low hum of refrigeration units from the facility itself audible even at this distance. Caruso ran final comms check. Earpieces in, channels confirmed, breach teams in position on all entry points, holding until Luciano's signal. Luciano stood outside the vehicle for 30 seconds and let the cold air clear his head completely. The shoulder was not fine. He had been overstating its condition since the Halstead meeting, and the blow from Damiano's pistol grip had reopened something in the wound that Dr. Ferrante had closed 2 days ago, and the bandaging under his shirt was doing its job. But the pain was operating at a level that required continuous conscious management. He could feel it trying to eat into his concentration at the edges, and he kept redirecting that concentration back to the operational center by sheer repetition, the way you redirect a flame with your hand, feeling it, noting it, not allowing it to spread. He touched his earpiece. On my signal. Acknowledgements came back, 5 voices, clipped and ready. He looked at Enzo. Enzo looked back at him with the face of a man who is committed. They moved. The north approach to the facility ran along a loading alley between the cold storage building and a neighboring warehouse, narrow enough that they moved single file with their backs occasionally brushing the corrugated metal wall on the right. The thermal drone had updated positions 3 minutes ago. The 2 signatures in the east office room were unchanged. The clusters at the south and north entries had shifted slightly, which Caruso's team had adjusted for. 11 men. 2 of them were with Sofia. Luciano counted 20 steps down the alley, hit the corner, stopped. Enzo came up behind him. Through the thin wall of the facility, he could hear the refrigeration hum, louder now, a constant mechanical undertone that would cover a certain amount of movement and nothing more. He keyed his earpiece twice. The signal. The south breach hit first. He heard it as a compression of sound, a controlled explosion at the entry point, immediately followed by shouting and then gunfire, and the facility's interior erupted into the precise chaos he had designed it to produce. He heard the north breach a second later, Caruso's team punching through, and the response inside redistributed exactly as predicted. Sound pulling bodies toward sound, men moving to engage the breaches, the defensive geometry of the facility folding toward its perimeter. He and Enzo were already moving. They came through a maintenance access panel on the east face, not the sealed fire door, which Caruso had flagged, but a utility access point 2 meters north of it that appeared on the original building permit and hadn't been modified. Enzo had the panel off in 8 seconds. They were inside. The interior of the facility was cold and harshly lit. Industrial fluorescence over a vast refrigerated storage space, racks of shelving running in long rows. The ambient temperature somewhere around 38 degrees that hit Luciano's face like a correction and made his shoulders scream in a new register. He shut that out. Moved. The gunfight was happening on the other side of the facility, maybe 60 meters south. He could hear it clearly now. Multiple weapons shouting in both Italian and what might have been English. The specific cacophony of a coordinated breach meeting, a prepared defense. Caruso's team was taking fire. That was expected. He couldn't do anything about it right now. He counted the racks. 3rd row from the east wall. The office room should be a door. Metal, institutional, a small reinforced window at eye height, a light inside visible through the window, and a man standing in front of it. One of Marco's, late 30s, large, with the particular posture of someone stationed rather than positioned, assigned to this door and staying at this door regardless of the chaos erupting at the other end of the building, which told Luciano 2 things: that this man had discipline and that Marco had specifically told him not to move no matter what he heard, which meant Marco had anticipated the breach pattern, had anticipated that the logical play was to draw his men to the perimeter while someone came for the interior. Luciano moved before the man finished turning at the sound of their approach, across the gap between the last rack and the door in a fast diagonal, hitting him low and driving him back into the door rather than away from it, getting inside the swing of the weapon before it could come up properly. They went against the door hard. The impact opened the wound fully. He felt it go, felt the bandaging fail, felt warmth spreading under his shirt, and he registered it with the distant precision of someone logging a data point they can't act on yet. The man was strong. He drove an elbow into Luciano's injured side, and Luciano felt it all the way to his back teeth, but he didn't let go, didn't give ground, and Enzo was there in the next second, clean and fast, and it was over in 8 seconds total. Luciano leaned against the door for one breath. 2. "You're bleeding through your shirt," Enzo said. "I know." He straightened, turned the door handle. Sofia was standing in the far corner of the room when the door opened. She had positioned herself with her back to the corner and a metal chair in her hands. The chair's legs forward, the only thing in the room that approximated a defensive object. And her face was set with the specific expression of someone who has been afraid for hours and has come all the way through the fear to something harder on the other side. She looked at Luciano. She looked at his shirt, at the blood. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes." She put the chair down. "Where's the other guard?" "Handled. There are 2 more somewhere." A shot came through the door's reinforced window, and they both went down. Luciano throwing himself at her, driving them both behind the metal work table that was the room's only substantial cover, the impact hitting his shoulder like a demolition and pulling a sound from him that he didn't mean to make. Sofia's hands found his face in the low cover. "I'm fine," he said. His voice had gone rough. "You're not." "Sofia, you're not fine," she said. Her hands moved to his shoulder, pressing, and the pain was extraordinary and immediate, and he breathed through it with his jaw locked. "How many?" 2 more. Plus the breach teams are engaged south." He got his weapon up over the table edge without showing his head. "Enzo, north side of the rack, I see them." The second guard was moving along the east wall trying to flank their position. Professional, careful, using the refrigeration racks for cover in the same way they were using the table. The third had gone static behind a support pillar near the door, controlling the exit. "The exit," Sofia said. Her voice was low and completely level, which was either shock or something else. "The maintenance panel you came through, is it clear?" "Should be." "Then we don't need to go through the door." He looked at her. "East wall," she said. "The panel is east. That's behind us, not through them." 3 seconds. He ran it. She was right. "Enzo," he said. "East wall, now." Enzo was already moving, breaking from the rack position with suppressing fire toward the pillar, driving the static guard's head down, crossing the space in a controlled sprint toward the maintenance opening. The flanking guard came up and Enzo took him in the shoulder, kept moving. Luciano got to his feet. Sofia was up with him, her hand finding his uninjured arm, not holding him back but not letting go, and they moved together across the cold storage space toward the east wall while the gunfire behind them continued its brutal conversation, and he thought about her standing in that corner with a metal chair between her and whatever came through the door, and he thought, as they pushed through the maintenance panel into the cold night air, with Enzo covering their exit, that he had never in his life felt the particular quality of this specific and unreasonable thing, and that he was going to have to find a name for it because it was clearly not going away. They came out of the alley and Luciano keyed his earpiece. "Packages out, east side. All teams pull back." Caruso's voice came back clipped and slightly wrecked. "South team has 2 down. North is clear. We're pulling." 2 down. Luciano filed it and kept moving, across the street into the shadow of the neighboring warehouse, putting distance between themselves and the facility while the gunfire inside decreased and then stopped, replaced by the specific silence of a concluded engagement. Enzo had a vehicle 1 block north. They reached it. Sofia got in the back. Luciano got in beside her. Enzo drove without being told. For 30 seconds, nobody spoke. The vehicle moved through Bridgeport's empty midnight streets, and the city did what cities do. Indifferent, continuous, enormous. And in the back seat, Luciano sat with his shoulder bleeding through his shirt, and his head pressed back against the headrest, and his eyes on the ceiling, just breathing. Sofia's hand found his on the seat between them. Not speaking, just contact. He turned his hand over, held hers. Marco wasn't there. he said. I know, she said. He left an hour ago. One of the guards told me not to be informative, just to tell me my situation. He said Mr. DeMarco sends his regards and will be in contact about the terms. She paused. He knew you were coming. He left the guards and left. He used you as a trap, Luciano said. He used me as a test, Sophia said, to see if you'd come, to confirm what he thinks he knows about you. She paused. Did his test give him useful information? Luciano thought about that. Yes, he said. Then you need to assume he's already planning his next move with that information in it. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark of the vehicle. She looked back at him, tired, steady, with a bruise forming along her left cheekbone that made something in his chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with the shoulder wound and everything to do with the name he was still trying to find. You're hurt, he said. I'm fine. Sophia. I said I'm fine. She held his gaze. Dr. Ferrante can look at it when we get back. Your shoulder is significantly more urgent. She paused. The archive, is it secure? Yes. Agent Hale. She knows. Her team has the building. A pause. And Marco? He looked at her for a long moment. She was asking not about the operational status, but about the agreement, about whether he had held it, whether the version of himself she kept insisting existed had held the line that the version he was more familiar with would have abandoned. He wasn't there, Luciano said, so the question is deferred. But when it's not deferred, he looked at the ceiling again. He stands trial. That's the agreement. He felt her hand tighten slightly in his. I meant it. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The compound at 2 in the morning had the quality of a place that had been through something and was still integrating it. Men moving with the careful deliberateness of exhaustion, low voices, the smell of coffee and antiseptic from the medical room where Dr. Ferrante was working on Caruso's 2 wounded. Luciano sat on the medical table while Ferrante rebandaged his shoulder with the barely contained irritation of a physician whose patient keeps undoing his work, and he held his phone and looked at the last text from Agent Hale. Building secured. 11 detained, including 3 with direct Meridian freight connections. Archive received and confirmed. Senator Crane's office notified of pending federal action at 0300. We need to meet tomorrow. And below it a second message. Mr. DeMarco. Marco DeMarco was not among the detained. We have a bolo active. Where do you think he goes? Luciano thought about it for a long time. He thought about a lake 40 miles outside the city. A gray-haired man with his father's eyes teaching a boy patience in the dark before dawn. He typed, I know where he goes. No. The lake was called Hennessy, a private body of water in a forested area 42 miles northwest of Chicago that Marco had owned through a corporate trust for 30 years. The property had a small cabin, a dock, a boathouse, and the kind of seclusion that was either recreational or tactical, depending on who was using it and why. Luciano had been there 14 times in his life. He had not been there in 11 years. He told Hale's team the location and told them to hold at the property boundary until he went in first. She argued. He said, he'll run if he sees federal vehicles. He's been running this calculation for 30 years and he will identify federal positioning at 200 meters and he will be gone. Let me go in. A long pause on the other end, then 30 minutes. After that, we come in regardless. He drove alone. No Enzo. Enzo was managing the compound and the aftermath. No Caruso. Just Luciano and the highway north and the dark sky beginning to lighten at its eastern edge in the faint gray suggestion of a dawn that was still an hour away. The shoulder had been properly dressed. Ferrante had given him something for the pain that he had accepted and then not taken because he needed to be fully present for what came next. And the pain was doing its specific work at the edge of everything, which was uncomfortable but useful. It kept him sharp in the way that comfort never could. He thought about Marco's voice on the phone. You're not going to shoot me. He thought about his own voice agreeing to the terms. He stands trial. He thought about Sophia's hand in the dark of the vehicle and the bruise on her cheekbone, and the way she'd stood in that corner with a metal chair between herself and the door. He drove. The property came up at the end of a dirt road through second-growth forest, the cabin dark against the tree line, the lake visible beyond it as a flat gray mirror in the pre-dawn light. Marco's vehicle was parked beside the boathouse, not hidden, not particularly, which meant either he didn't know Luciano was coming or he had decided it didn't matter. Luciano parked at the tree line and walked the last 200 meters. The cabin door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The interior was as he remembered it. Small, plain, the walls hung with fishing equipment and old photographs. A lamp was on in the corner. A fire had been started in the wood stove and was now down to coals, giving the room a low orange warmth. And Marco DeMarco was sitting in the same chair he had always sat in at this cabin in every iteration of this visit across 30 years, with his hands on the armrests and his eyes on the door, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known, as if... And Luciano absorbed this as he stepped through the door. He had always known this was where it ended. "Luca," Marco said. His voice was tired. The performance was gone. The careful warmth, the calculated deployment of history and affection, all of it gone. What was left was just a 61-year-old man in a cabin by a lake who had run the numbers one final time and understood what they added up to. Luciano stopped in the middle of the room. He did not raise his weapon, not yet. "You knew I'd come here," Luciano said. "Yes." "You've always known, if it came to this, I'd come here." "Yes." Marco looked at him with those eyes, the family's eyes, tired now, carrying something that was not guilt but was in its neighborhood, something like the exhaustion that comes from a very long time of choosing correctly by one set of rules and understanding, too late, that the rules were wrong. "You're here to take me in." Not a question, an observation. "Yes," Luciano said. Marco nodded slowly. His hands moved slightly on the armrests, not toward a weapon, just the small, restless movement of a man sitting with the weight of a conclusion. "The girl," he said. "She's safe. And the archive. Federal custody." Marco absorbed that. Crane will have lawyers that cost more than some countries. He will. The documentation is thorough enough that it doesn't matter. Whitmore. Whitmore is done. Marco looked at the fire's coals. "I built something," he said quietly, "for 30 years. I built it and I held it together when it should have fractured a dozen times. Your father." He stopped. "Your father was a better man than me, and he was also a worse operator. He had the conscience and I had the patience, and between us we made something that lasted." He paused. "I thought that was worth protecting." "You thought protecting it was worth my brother's life," Luciano said. The sentence landed in the room without decoration. Marco looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I did." The simplicity of it was terrible. No justification, no architecture of reasoning. Just a man who had made a calculation and was past the point of dressing it differently. Luciano's hand was on his weapon, not raised, just there, his fingers on the grip, the weight of it against his palm, and the agreement with Agent Hale sitting in his chest like something structural that he was either going to hold or not hold. And the decision of that felt, in this moment, like the actual decision, the real one, the one that all the others had been building toward. He thought about what Marco had said at the Halstead meeting. "You don't have the capacity for this." He thought about Sophia saying, "You act like brutality makes you powerful, but all I see is a man terrified of grief." He thought about Matteo, 28 years old with meticulous handwriting in the margins of a logistics report, trying to do the right thing, coming to the one man he trusted and finding the wrong door. Luciano's hand left his weapon. He reached into his jacket and produced a zip tie, the same kind they'd used on Sophia, he noted with a specific bitterness, and held it out. "Stand up," he said. Marco looked at the zip tie, looked at Luciano's face. "You're more like your father than I thought," he said. "I know," Luciano said. "Stand up." Marco stood. He was slower than he used to be. The weight of 61 years and the specific weight of tonight, both of them in his joints as he came up from the chair. He stood in front of Luciano with his hands at his sides, and looked at his nephew with those dark, tired eyes, and Luciano held the look and did not look away from what was in it. The whole long history of it, the fishing trips and the chess games, and the hand on his shoulder at his father's grave, all of it present and all of it permanently complicated now, layered over with what could not be unlayered, and Luciano held all of it in his chest without letting it move his hands anywhere they'd agreed not to go. He reached for Marco's wrists, and Marco moved, not toward a weapon, away from one, toward the door. Fast and low with the desperate explosive speed of a 61-year-old man who had decided, in the final second, that he would not be taken, that this ending was not the one he would accept. And Luciano caught him by the collar, and they went into the wall together. A photograph of the lake falling from the hook and hitting the floor, Marco driving an elbow back and catching Luciano's wounded shoulder with the precision of someone who knew exactly where it was. And the pain that followed was extraordinary and total. And Luciano held on anyway, held on with his good arm and his full weight, and his teeth locked against the sound that wanted to come out, and drove Marco into the wall a second time, harder, and this time Marco's legs went, and they both went down to the cabin floor in a heap of tangled limbs, an old relationship, and irreconcilable facts. Luciano got the zip tie on in the end. He sat on the floor beside his uncle with his back against the wall, and his shoulder on fire, and his head dropped back, and his chest heaving, both of them breathing hard in the orange glow of the dying coals. And outside, through the cabin's small window, the sky was doing something. The absolute black of full night giving way at its edges to the very first suggestion of gray. The change so gradual it was almost theoretical. But there, undeniably there, the night making its slow, irrevocable concession to the dawn came in the way dawns come after nights like that one. Not dramatic, not merciful, just the slow and indifferent return of light to a world that had continued operating without it. Luciano sat on the floor of the cabin with his back against the wall, and Marco zip-tied beside him, and he watched the window change from black to gray to the pale and colorless white of a November morning in northern Illinois. And he breathed, and he let the pain in his shoulder do whatever it was doing because there was nothing else to do about it right now. Marco had stopped fighting. He sat with his bound hands in his lap and his head tilted back against the wall and his eyes closed, and he might have been sleeping except that his breathing was too controlled, too deliberate. The breathing of a man staying very still inside himself. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It was Marco who broke it, finally, without opening his eyes. "Your father used to come here when he needed to think," he said. "Did you know that?" "No." "Before you were born. Before the organization was what it became. He'd drive out here alone and sit on the dock for hours." A pause. "He told me once this was the only place he felt like himself. Not the name, not the business, just a man by a lake." His voice was very quiet and stripped of everything except the fact of it. "I used to think that was weakness, needing a place like that." Luciano said nothing. "I was wrong about a number of things," Marco said. Still eyes closed, still the controlled breathing. "I won't insult you by listing them. You know what they are." "Yes." Outside, through the cabin's thin walls, Luciano could hear the first birds beginning, tentative, exploratory, the sound of small creatures checking whether the world was still navigable. A car on the distant road, the lake doing what lakes do, which was nothing, which was everything. "Matteo," Luciano said. Marco opened his eyes. "Tell me how it happened," Luciano said. "Not the why. I have the why. Tell me how." A long silence. Marco looked at the window, at the growing light. "He came to me on a Wednesday," Marco said. "Showed me the ledger pages he'd found. He was frightened, but he was also certain, the way young men are certain when they've discovered something they think changes the moral landscape permanently." He paused. "He said he was going to bring it to you, that the family didn't need to be part of something like this, that you would agree." He stopped. His jaw moved. "He trusted me. He sat in my kitchen and showed me the documents and trusted me to help him take it to you correctly." The words fell into the room and stayed there. "And instead," Luciano said, "and instead I made a phone call." Marco's voice had lost something in the telling, some final insulation. "I gave them the timeline. I told them he had the documents. I said it had to be done before he reached you. He looked at the floor. They were efficient. It was that night. Luciano absorbed this with his eyes on the wall opposite. He felt something move through him that was enormous and quiet, and that he was not going to let become anything that changed his hand's current position, which was still, resting on his knees, doing nothing. He called me that afternoon, Luciano said, to ask if you were trustworthy. Marco looked at him sharply. Wednesday afternoon, Luciano said. He called me and said he had something important and he wanted to know if he could trust Marco with it before he brought it to me directly. I said yes. He paused. The pause lasted a long time. I said yes without asking what it was because I had 40 years of evidence that the answer was yes. His voice remained flat. I was the one who sent him to you. Marco was very still. I've known that since Renato decrypted the call records, Luciano said. Matteo called me. Then he called you. Then he was dead. He looked at Marco directly. That's not absolution for you. It doesn't change what you chose. But I need you to understand that I know my part in it. I know the chain. He held Marco's gaze. That's why I can honor the agreement with Agent Hale. Because if I kill you, I'm just another link in the same chain. And I'm finished being that. Marco looked at him for a long time with those dark, exhausted eyes. Luca, he said. Don't, Luciano said. Not hard. Just final. Don't say anything that sounds like redemption. You don't get that from me. You get a trial. You get to testify. You get to be the thread that pulls this thing apart so that those 41 names mean something. He paused. That's what you get. Headlights appeared through the window, the first of Hale's vehicles coming down the dirt road, moving slowly, honoring the 30-minute window he'd asked for. Marco looked at the lights. Then he looked at his hands. He nodded once. It was not forgiveness, and it was not surrender, and it was not peace. It was just an old man by a lake in the early morning, nodding at the shape of what came next. Luciano stood. Special Agent Christine Hale was 51 years old, wore no jewelry, and had the face of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people lied to her and had developed a corresponding directness that bypassed most of the conventional social infrastructure. She shook Luciano's hand at the cabin door with the specific grip of someone assessing rather than greeting, and her eyes went immediately to his shoulder, then to Marco seated inside, then back to Luciano's face. You could have called us in earlier, she said. I needed him to stay. And if he'd fought? He did, Luciano said. Briefly. She looked at his shoulder again. Dr. Ferrante, your compound's physician, is he licensed in Illinois? Yes. Have him look at that today, not tomorrow. She paused. The debrief. I need you in our Chicago field office at 2 this afternoon. Can you do that? Yes. Bring the woman, Sofia Valenti. Her testimony about the 11 days of captivity and her father's documentation of the Meridian Network will be. She's a central witness. She needs independent legal representation before she speaks to us. Make sure she understands that. I'll tell her. Hale held his gaze for an extra moment, reading something, running some internal assessment. You understand what today begins, she said. Not a question. More like she was making sure he was looking at the full shape of it. Yes, Luciano said. Grand jury proceedings, likely 8 to 12 months. Your full cooperation means significant exposure for your organization. People who were loyal to you are going to face charges. I know. You personally are facing, I know what I'm facing, he said. Not impatient, just clear. I made the agreement with my eyes open. What happens to me in the legal process happens. The Meridian Network goes down, Crane and Whitmore are indicted. Those 41 names get justice. That's the order of priority. Hale studied him for another moment. Then she said very quietly, something that wasn't part of any official proceeding. Your brother would have liked this outcome. Luciano looked at her. He didn't have anything to say to that. He stepped aside and let her people in. He drove back to Chicago in the full morning light, the highway opening up in front of him with the particular clarity of a day that had not yet accumulated its weather. The sky a pale winter blue and the city's skyline appearing on the horizon ahead with the same indifference it always had, enormous and unconcerned, as though the last 14 hours had happened in a separate dimension that the city had no record of. His phone had 7 messages. He looked at them at a red light south of the highway interchange. Enzo, twice. Operational updates both. Renato, once, confirming the archive transfer. Ferretti, relaying that Damiano and the 2 complicit members from the Halstead meeting were in federal custody as of 6 that morning, transferred without incident. Caruso, clipped and professional. 2 men wounded, none critical, all stable. The 7th message was from a number he didn't recognize. Italian country code, the call placed at 4:15 in the morning. He listened to the voicemail. Vittorio Valenti's voice, thinner than Sofia had described it, and carrying the specific quality of a man speaking from a very long distance in every sense. Mr. DeMarco, I understand my daughter is safe. I understand the documentation has reached federal authorities. A pause that lasted several seconds. I am not asking for anything. I'm not in a position to ask for anything. Another pause. I want you to know that I am aware of what my choices cost. My son, Matteo, was my son too, in the way that the children of people you've wronged are still people you've wronged. I am aware. The recording ended without a farewell. Luciano set the phone down. He drove the rest of the way in silence. Sofia was in the compound's main room when he arrived, sitting at the long table with a cup of coffee and Renato's documentation files spread before her, not reading them, just sitting with them, her hands around the cup and her eyes somewhere else. The bruise on her cheekbone had darkened overnight into a deep purple blue that the morning light made very visible. She had changed clothes. Someone had found her a clean sweater, gray, slightly too large. She had pushed the sleeves up. Her hair was pulled back roughly, a few pieces loose around her face. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went immediately to his shoulder, then to his face, in exactly the same order Hales had, which he noted was something he was still finding a name for. Marco? She said. Federal custody. Hales' team took him from the cabin at 6. He sat down at the table across from her, slowly. The shoulder was making its opinions very clear now that the operational necessity of ignoring it had passed. He'll be processed today. Debrief at 2 this afternoon. Hale wants you there. Independent legal representation first. I'll have someone in contact with you before noon. Sofia nodded, looked at her coffee. You went to the lake alone. Yes. Enzo told me. Enzo wasn't supposed to tell you. Enzo was concerned, she said. He expressed it by informing me. She looked up. You could have taken someone with you. I needed to do it alone. Luciano, Sofia. He held her gaze. It needed to be me. The way it needed to be me when I made the decision to cooperate with Hale, and when I stood in that cabin and chose not to. When I honored the agreement. Those aren't things you do with an audience. He paused. They're things you do in front of yourself, so you know afterward that they happened. She looked at him for a long moment with the particular quality of attention she brought to things. The same attention she'd brought to his face in the medical room and on the rooftop. The attention of someone who looked past the surface of things, not because it was polite, but because she couldn't help it, because it was structurally how she was made. You're in pain, she said. Yes. Dr. Ferrante. After this. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. There are things I need to say to you before the legal process starts and lawyers become involved and everything becomes official and formal and structured. He held her eyes. I need to say them now. Sofia set down her coffee. She was very still. I abducted you, Luciano said. I brought you to a room and kept you there for 11 days, and I designed conditions to psychologically break you. I did that with full knowledge and intent. There is no version of events in which that becomes acceptable. Not the larger conspiracy that framed it, not the fact that I was wrong about your father, not anything that happened after. He kept his voice level and direct because the only honesty available to him was the kind that didn't try to soften its own edges. What I did to you caused harm that you will carry. I know that. I'm not asking you to tell me otherwise. Sophia said nothing. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was very composed in the way it got when she was processing something fully and from the inside. I'm also not going to tell you that it was justified by anything, he continued. Not Mateo's death, not 22 years of conflict with your father's name, not my grief, not my anger, not anything. He paused. It wasn't. It was wrong. I did it. I'm not in a position to make it right, and I know that. The room was quiet. Somewhere deeper in the compound, two men were talking in low voices. A door closed. The compound's ordinary sounds. What are you asking me? Sophia said. Her voice was very even. I'm not asking you anything, Luciano said. That's the point. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not putting something on you to carry because of my guilt. I'm saying it plainly because you deserve to have it said plainly. He held her gaze. After what you did, staying, helping, building the case, after all of that, you deserve at minimum the truth said directly without any of it buried under everything that came after. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I know what you did. I was there. She paused. And I know what you chose every time there was a choice, from the moment you understood you were wrong. I watched you make every one of those choices. She reached across the table and pushed the documentation files slightly to one side, clearing the space between them. I'm not going to tell you that the 11 days didn't happen. They did. I'm not going to tell you they didn't cost me things. They did. She held his eyes. But I'm also not going to pretend that everything that happened after was irrelevant. The man who sat on a rooftop and said dismantling all of this was the right thing, that man was also real. Both things are true simultaneously. That's a generous reading, he said. That's an accurate reading, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her hands on the table, at the bruise on her cheekbone, at the too large gray sweater and the loose hair and the French paperback that someone had placed on the table beside her files, its spine still broken. Your thesis, he said. Your apartment. Your life in Wicker Park. He paused. All of that is manageable, she said. The thesis will keep. The apartment is fixable. She looked at him steadily. I'm not fragile, Luciano. Don't start treating me like I am now because the crisis has passed. Something moved in his face, something brief and honest that he didn't manage to compose before she saw it. What? She said. You keep doing that, he said. What? You keep. Every time I am braced for the thing that should logically follow, the withdrawal, the appropriate distance, the entirely reasonable response of a person who has been treated the way you've been treated. He stopped. You don't do it. You just... He made a slight gesture that wasn't quite finished. Stay. Sophia looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite the absence of one. I'm aware of the pattern, she said. Why? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything, not deflecting, not making it easier than it was. Because I saw something in you from the beginning that you couldn't see, she said finally, even in the worst of it, in the room, in the 11 days. She paused. Something that was broken rather than absent. There's a difference between a man who lacks a conscience and a man whose conscience has been buried under so much of the wrong kind of survival that he can't find it anymore. She paused again. I've spent 4 years studying how to restore damaged things. You learn to look for the original underneath the damage. She held his gaze. The original was there. Luciano looked at her across the table. He thought about Marco saying, You don't have the capacity for this. He thought about what it had cost to prove that wrong, not by violence, which would have been easy, which had always been easy, but by the specific effort of choosing differently, against everything trained into him, in the cabin with the dawn coming through the window and his bound uncle watching. He thought about Mateo's handwriting in the margins of a logistics report. Sophia, he said. Yes. After this is done, the proceedings, the testimony, all of it, when it's finished. He paused. What do you want? She looked at him. The question had weight, and she gave it the weight it had. I want to finish my thesis, she said. I want to sleep without listening for gunshots. I want to eat a meal that isn't designed by someone else. She paused. And I want to know that the 41 names in that archive actually result in something, that they're not just documentation, that they become accountability. Hale will make sure of that. Then help her, Sophia said. Give her everything, testify. Be the cooperative witness that the case needs you to be, even when it's expensive. She held his eyes. Especially when it's expensive. Yes, he said. And after all of that, she said very carefully, I want to see what this is. She made a small gesture between them. Not romantic, not dramatic, just honest. What this actually is, outside of crisis and captivity and burning buildings. I want to see if it exists when nothing is on fire. Luciano looked at her for a long moment. It might be much less interesting, he said. I'm counting on that, she said. The legal proceedings began that afternoon and did not end for 14 months. The grand jury convened in December and handed down indictments in March of the following year. Senator Harold Crane resigned his seat on a Tuesday morning and was arrested by federal marshals before the press conference announcing his resignation had concluded. Prosecutor Douglas Whitmore was suspended from his position and subsequently indicted on 9 counts including obstruction of justice and conspiracy to facilitate trafficking. The 2 aldermen entered plea agreements in exchange for testimony. Meridian Freight's operational infrastructure was dismantled by a joint federal task force across 3 states, and the network's principal operators received sentences that Hale, in a rare moment of visible satisfaction, described to the Chicago Tribune as appropriate. Marco DeMarco testified for 11 days across 2 separate hearings. He was thorough and precise and evidently made a decision somewhere in the process that if he was going to do this, he would do it completely. Luciano sat in the federal building's corridor during the first day of Marco's testimony and did not go in. He sat in a plastic chair with a paper coffee cup and looked at the floor and let the hours pass. Enzo sat beside him and didn't say much. At one point, Enzo said, "You don't have to be here at all." And Luciano said, "Yes, I do." And they left it there. Luciano's own cooperation agreement resulted in a negotiated outcome that took 11 months to finalize. He provided testimony on his organization's operations spanning 12 years, gave complete financial disclosure, and named every individual he knew to be involved in the conspiracy's cover operations. In exchange for cooperation, certain charges were reduced or deferred. Others were not. He served 8 months in a minimum security facility in Wisconsin, beginning in the spring, which meant he was out by the following January. Enzo visited twice. Renato sent books. Ferretti wrote letters in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had not written many letters and was trying to do it properly. Sophia came on the 3rd week, and every 3rd week after that, which was more often than she had said she would come, which he noted and did not mention. She brought books, different from Renato's, heavier in the academic direction, art history texts and exhibition catalogs, and once, inexplicably, a slim volume on the restoration of Flemish panel paintings that was so specialized it clearly had no other possible recipient. She brought news of the proceedings in the careful, factual way of someone who understood that he needed to know and didn't need to be protected from knowing. She brought herself, which was the thing that mattered, and the thing neither of them had developed quite the right language for yet. And they sat across a table in a visiting room and talked with the specific quality of people who have been through something together that most people have not been through and are now finding out what they are in the absence of emergency. They argued, about books occasionally, about the pace of the federal proceedings sometimes. Once, memorably, about whether the restoration of a damaged thing ever fully returned it to its original state or whether the repair itself became part of what the thing was. An argument that was superficially about a 15th century altarpiece Sophia was writing about, and was not, at any level, only about that. The repair changes it, Luciano said. Obviously, Sophia said, but changed isn't the same as lesser. He looked at her across the visiting room table. No, he said, it isn't. She looked back at him without looking away, which was something she had always done, from the first night in the compound's main hall, and which had never stopped being the most disorienting thing about her, the looking without flinching, not because she didn't see clearly, but because she did. He was released on a Wednesday in January, which was not a dramatic day. It was cold and overcast, and the road outside the facility was gray and wet with old snow pushed to its margins. And Enzo was waiting with a car that was neither ostentatious nor particularly comfortable, which was exactly right. They drove for an hour mostly in silence, the Wisconsin highway flattening out toward the Illinois border, the landscape winter spare and honest. Organization? Luciano said, eventually. Dissolved, Enzo said. The remaining senior members have been in private business for 6 months. Clean, licensed, legitimate. Mostly. He paused. Ferretti opened a restaurant in Oak Park. It's actually very good. He sent a reservation under your name for next week. Luciano looked at the road. Marco? Sentenced in October. 15 years, minimum security, Wisconsin actually. Different facility, 40 miles from yours. Enzo glanced at him briefly. He asked, through counsel, whether you would accept correspondence. The question sat in the car for a moment. I don't know, Luciano said. That's what I told them. That's the honest answer. Yes, Enzo said. I thought so. They crossed the state line into Illinois, and Chicago's skyline appeared ahead in the gray January light, the same indifferent enormousness it always had. And Luciano looked at it through the windshield and felt, not the old ownership of it, not the sense of a man looking at what he controls, something quieter and less claimed. A city he used to rule and no longer did. A city he would live in differently now, smaller and more ordinary, and in many ways better for it. Where are we going? Luciano said. Enzo said, Where do you want to go, Tab? The apartment was in Wicker Park. This had not been planned, exactly. It had emerged over the course of the visiting room conversations and the careful epistolary months as a fact that assembled itself gradually from a series of smaller acknowledgments, the way facts do when two people are being honest with each other and there is nothing external pressing them toward pretense. Sophia's apartment was 2 blocks from her university. It was small and densely inhabited, books everywhere, restoration tools on the kitchen table more often than not, the smell of coffee and linseed oil, and the specific pleasant disorder of a space where someone was actually living rather than merely residing. She had a small guest room, which had been used as a storage room until the fall, when she had cleared it out and put a bed in it without making any announcement about why. He moved into the guest room in January. He was not, for the first time in his adult life, in charge of anything. He slept through his first 3 nights without waking, which was something that had not happened in over 20 years, and which he didn't mention until the 4th morning when Sophia asked over coffee how he'd slept, and he was quiet for a moment before answering. Well, he said. She nodded as though this was expected and returned to her notes. He enrolled in a continuing education course at the university, business law, 3 evenings a week, an absurd thing for a former organized crime boss in his late 30s, and he sat in the back row and took notes in the careful handwriting of someone relearning the uses of patience. The professor was 29 years old and occasionally looked at him with the expression of a person trying to place a face. Luciano did not assist with this. He found work eventually through a legitimate channel Ferretti helped arrange, consulting for a logistics firm whose compliance infrastructure was a genuine disaster, a company that needed someone who understood, from a very complete perspective, every way a supply chain could be exploited. The work was not glamorous. It paid a salary. He came home in the evenings to a small apartment in Wicker Park and hung his coat on the hook by the door, and the smell of the apartment was familiar, and the person at the table was familiar, and neither of these things had been true of any space he'd occupied in the previous 2 decades. There were nights when the weight of what he'd been, what he'd done, found him in the dark. They were not infrequent, and they were not brief. He did not pretend to Sophia that they weren't happening, and she did not pretend that they required resolution by morning. Some things, they had both accepted, were not resolvable. They were only navigable. The difference was significant. He went with her, in March, to the Federal Victim Services Center where Hale's task force was coordinating restitution for the survivors identified in the Meridian Archive. The center was in a nondescript building on the northwest side, and Sophia was there in a professional capacity. She had been working with the case's victim advocates since the fall, offering research support and documentation assistance. She did not ask Luciano to come. He came because he wanted to be there, which was the only reason that would have been acceptable to either of them. He sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room while Sophia met with the advocates, and he thought about 41 names and the ones that hadn't been documented, and everything that the archive represented in its most human terms. And he thought about Matteo driving the process from the inside of a warehouse ledger with his meticulous handwriting, dying for it. And the thought did not resolve into anything comfortable or redemptive, because some things are not meant to. They walked back to her car in the cold March afternoon with the city moving around them in its ordinary March way, and Sophia took his hand on the sidewalk without commentary, and he held it, and they walked. "Thesis," he said. "Submitted last week," she said. "Defense is in April." "How is it?" "It's good," she said without false modesty. "It's the best work I've done. It took me longer than it should have because—" She stopped, considered. "Because I'm a different person than the one who started it." The argument shifted. The central question changed. What was the original question? Whether restoration returns a damaged work to its authentic state. And now? She was quiet for a moment, walking, her hand in his, the March wind in her face. "Whether the experience of damage becomes part of authenticity," she said. "Whether something that has been broken and repaired is less itself or more." Luciano walked beside her. He thought about a room with a locked door and a French paperback and a woman who translated manuscripts in the dark to keep herself intact. He thought about a cabin by a lake and a zip tie and an agreement honored against the grain of everything. He thought about Enzo in a plastic chair in a federal building corridor and Renato sending books and the specific quality of 8 months in Wisconsin, the strange, slow duration of it, the way it had moved through him like a long illness that left things altered. He thought about a girl in the snow outside a New York subway station who had stayed because she couldn't make herself leave, pressing a scarf against a stranger's side and saying, "Please stay alive." He thought about the kind of accounting that takes years to understand fully, the debts that run in unexpected directions, the costs that announce themselves late, the things that are not repaid because they can't be, and are not forgiven because forgiveness is not the right word, and are simply carried, integrated, part of the shape of what you are now. "More itself," he said. Sophia glanced at him sideways. "The answer to your question," he said. "More itself." She looked at him for a moment with those eyes, the same ones he'd seen across the compound's main hall in candlelight, and in a dark room with blood on her hands, and in a visiting room across a table, and now here, in March afternoon light, on a sidewalk in Wicker Park. And she didn't say anything immediately, and the silence between them had the quality it had always had at its best, which was not empty but full, dense with the weight of everything that had passed between them and everything that was still in process and everything that neither of them needed to perform for the benefit of the other. "That's an argument," she said finally. "I know," he said. "Make the counter-argument." "In the defense," she said. "You're coming." "Yes," he said. "I am." The city moved around them. A bus passed. A child on the opposite sidewalk was being pulled along by a large dog with no interest in walking slowly. 2 men outside a coffee shop were having an argument about something, and neither of them was paying attention to anything else. The sky was the particular gray of a Chicago March, which was not the gray of defeat, but the gray of a city that has been through winter and knows spring is a fact rather than a hope. Luciano DeMarco walked beside Sophia Valenti through the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary city that did not know him anymore, which was exactly as he wanted it, and held her hand, which was where it had been since the sidewalk and where it was going to stay, and said nothing further because everything that needed saying had been said, and what remained was the living of it, which was a different thing entirely, and which was, for the first time in his life, enough.